Okay. Good morning, everyone. Hey, Mick, could you close the doors out there? Yeah. Okay. All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for coming here. The semester is just kicking off. Those of you who walked here, went Metro or went on Uber, probably saw lots of young people wheeling baskets of clothing and other household goods around the dorm room and loading in. So parking is horrible. So I hope you did not try to drive. This session today is, for those of you wondering, is actually very well attended for the topic. So it turns out, just if you're curious, we had about over 400 registrants in total, of which 100 said they would sort of be here. So we always get some melt. So it's interesting to see what's happening. And I'm really glad to see everyone. You know, the campus has been a bit bare, not just during the normal summer, but of course, COVID and everything else. So we've gotten back to having more in-person events, but this is probably the largest in-person space event I think that we've had, both hybrid and in-person, really since the pandemic started. So first of all, thank you all for being here, and it's really good to be back. This is, as you'll hear, is a very important topic that the Vice President's announcement early this year of a unilateral U.S. commitment to not conduct destructive kinetic energy ASAT tests. And I will leave it to our folks from State and Defense to parse every word of that statement. Was a very important step, I think, in changing the diplomatic tone around discussions of dealing with long-term sustainability in space. To start with, I want to introduce you to my boss, Dean Ayers, is the Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs here, and she helps make all this possible. And people ask me, what's a space guy doing in a School of International Affairs? And I said, well, it's actually the perfect fit because there's probably nothing that cuts across more issues and more areas than how the United States and other states engage with each other in the space domain, militarily, scientifically, commercially. It's a new domain, relatively young, and lessons from the past and shaping the future are what we try to do here at the Elliott School. With that, Dean Ayers.
Thanks so much, Scott. And I just want to underscore what Professor Pace just said. We are welcoming our students back to campus. We've got move-in this week. We've got our new student orientation, and it is really nice to feel like we're welcoming the space policy community back to the Elliott School in person. It has indeed, even though we've been in person for a year now, it has been a little bit bare. So it's nice to be back in person in full force. As Professor Pace said, my name is Ssa Ayers, and I'm Dean of the George Washington University Elliott School of International Affairs. I think many of you are likely already aware that we are the only APSIA school, the only School of International Affairs with a space policy program. So we're very proud of our ability to highlight the role and relevance and importance of space policy issues in international affairs. As you all know, and I think that is the genesis of today's conversation, on April 18th, Vice President Kamala Harris announced that the United States had unilaterally committed itself not to conduct destructive direct-ascent anti-satellite missile tests. The Vice President characterized these tests, which in recent years have been carried out by China, India, and Russia, as dangerous, and she called on other countries to join this moratorium. Other countries have welcomed U.S. leadership in the effort to develop new international norms of responsible behavior in space. And like us, other countries have recognized how much the global economy and international security depend on access to space and the peaceful conduct of space activities. So the obvious question after this moratorium, assuming that it holds, is what comes next. Should there be a legally binding agreement like nuclear testing moratoriums led to nuclear test ban treaties? Should we look at steps to mitigate orbital debris that threaten satellites today? Should we look at better managing the growing number of satellites being launched today and ensure the long-term sustainability of space activities? So this is just a sample of questions being discussed today, part of a long tradition here at the Elliott School, in which we recognize the important role of science and technology in international affairs. In order to meet the urgency of today's global threats, including, as we are all aware, a pandemic, a climate in crisis, cybersecurity concerns. We believe it's increasingly important that we have international affairs practitioners with strong backgrounds in science and technology. And this year, we've been celebrating the 50th anniversary of the creation of the GW Institute for International Science and Technology Policy, the GW Space Policy Institute, and our Master of Arts program in International Science and Technology Policy. So like other centers and institutes at the Elliott School, we've taken advantage of our unique location in Washington, D.C. and right here, to attract distinguished faculty and researchers who are at home with both scholarly work as well as practical policymaking and management. A great example of how we combine scholarly work with practical policymaking is the ongoing partnership between the Space Policy Institute and the Center for Space Policy and Strategy at the Aerospace Corporation, which is a research institute with its own distinguished history in space, going back to the launch of Sputnik and the first reconnaissance satellites. Today, that partnership has brought together two distinguished panels to talk about developing norms of behavior in the space domain. The first panel consists of government experts. It's an interagency meeting right here. Government experts from state, defense, NASA, commerce, and Space Force. They will address the challenges they're seeing in international discussions today, made more difficult by ongoing tensions with both Russia and China. And the second panel will be a diverse group of industry experts who will talk about the role of the private sector in developing and implementing space norms of behavior. These experts represent the companies who track space debris and who have to manage the risks from the debris and who are developing technologies and services that may help us clean up space debris. So before we move to the panel discussion, I have the pleasure now of introducing the Executive Secretary of the National Space Council. I am reliably informed that he needs no introduction in this gathering. You do have his bio in your packet in front of you. He has a distinguished history of work in the space field, in government. He is no one better to be the Executive Secretary of the National Space Council. Let me turn things over now to Chirag Parikh for our keynote address.
Hi, I'm Chirag. All right, before we get to the more formal remarks, I want to put a few observations out there. First of all, how great is it? I know we've been kind of sort of doing this now over the past 6 months, but particularly in this venue is just fantastic. Thank you to GW and Aerospace for being able to help convene this opportunity. But looking at all these friends and colleagues out there, we know what's going to happen on Monday. We're all eagerly anticipating, NASA's Artemis launch there, and this will, I imagine, be one of those historic moments of where were you when type of thing. And so we're all excited about that. We think about this year. We think about the images that we saw with the James Webb Space Telescope, and we think about what we have coming forward from a diplomacy perspective. The historic investments that we have in our budgets all across the board, whether we're talking national security, we're talking commercial investments from the private sector, as well as in our civil space sector, whether we're talking human space exploration, we're talking Earth observation and climate change. There's so much going on right now, and it's sometimes amazing to think about the moment that you're in, and sometimes you have to wait years to reflect back on the moment. And so hopefully we take a moment to pause and think about where we're at right now. The other observation I'd just like to note is the half the panel there, particularly Mr. Del Bello and Mr. Langster there. Incredible thanks to you two for one, your commitment to the private sector and everything you guys have done in your long and storied careers, and the fact that you feel it's meaningful enough to come back into the government to be able to affect the change, being at the table to do that. I think that's incredible. And Eric, you've been kind of the steward for everything that we're going to talk about over the past decade on the international front and the interagency front, and sometimes taking a beating, sometimes giving a beating. So that's fantastic. And then last but not least, to Scott, who's been, a fantastic role model. It's an honor to be a successor to you at the White House. As we all know in this group, a lot of the work that we do is not pinned onto any particular administration, sometimes not even any particular decade. These are things like norms that have taken a long time to come, from thought to concept to almost there to actually there to now where do we go from here. So it's a great moment to be here, and I want to thank everybody for that. And finally, Dr. Ayers, again, thank you for allowing us to be here and kind of geek out for a few moments on space matters here. So, and then to last but not least to Jamie and the Aerospace Corporation. The papers that you guys are pushing out here are meaningful and effective, and I just think that we do a lot better by being able to read and understand the work that you guys do and kind of go into those deep dives. So thank you to you and your team as well there. So, okay, so last person I want to thank is Robin Dickey for the paper that she just wrote here. Maybe a hand of applause for this paper that you may or may not have seen here. I think I've had the opportunity to read it. I mean, there's some really interesting concepts there. I appreciate the useful analogies that you've done for simpletons like myself, and actually proposing meaningful actions that we as a government and as a private sector can say. And so I think it's 23 pages of worthwhile must-read material along the way. So let me before diving into the actual topic of what's next here, let's first, look, once an intelligence analyst, always an intelligence analyst. There's first baseline and understand where we are, with things right now, from a policy sense here. So as Dr. Ayers talked about, the Vice President stated in her remarks about the ASAT test moratorium, but she also said in the remarks, and I think it's very important to also highlight, rules and norms are shared principles that guide our behavior of people and communities. Now, I know in Robin's paper, she has a definition as well. These rules and norms are common understandings of what is right, what's wrong, and what is acceptable. And, and whether it's the way that we interact with our colleagues at work or with international partners or with industries, it all matters. And we live by these, whether we know them or we don't. And rules and norms provide us with a sense of order and stability. And, it's almost, if I might use astrophysics analogy for a second, it's kind of like dark matter. Sometimes it's there guiding us, but you might not even be able to observe it along the way there. So, and these are things where we can shape and build and being able to provide that type of order and stability. And we have literature as well that reinforces this as well. The President's interim national security strategic guidance also talks about norms. It says, we'll lead in promoting shared norms and forge new agreements on emerging technologies, which includes space. And then last December, we released the administration's space priorities framework. And a few of the elements from that is we understand space activities are evolving. When I started the National Security Council 10 years ago, 10 years ago, my gosh, 12 years ago now, feels like 12 weeks ago, but the environment was different. And when Scott was at the White House the first time, the environment was different. When Rich was at the White House, how many times have you been there now, Rich? 5, 6 times. He stopped counting. The environment was different. And so I think it's a recognition that, not only is it changing, but it's accelerating in change. And so, as activities evolve, our norms, our rules, our principles that guide our outer space activities need to also evolve as well. And part of the space priorities framework talks about the fact that we need to be able to be as a leader in the space industry, in the space community, ensure that we have responsible, peaceful, and sustainable exploration of use of space. Again, that's not just in our space priorities framework. And that's not just in the last administration's space policy. That's basically been in space policies since the dawn of space policies as well, right? And that's something that we continue to hold true as a foundational principle of how we interact. But obviously, without clear norms, we do face risks, we do face uncertainty. And that's kind of what we're here to discuss, is how do we move forward. And so this end, we're engaging with the international community. I'll leave that to Eric to discuss a little bit more in detail where we are from the international front there too. We also, I see so many of our industry partners here, and Jeff Trauberman was just getting a call from Branson, so I'm sorry he had to step out there for a second, but we need to see, we're very good friends over here. So, but we need to also make sure that we have partnership with our commercial partners as well, in developing these new measures. It can't just be a government-only element here. And I think particularly that's the value that we have with people like Travis and Richard here at the dais, which is they've had that experience who can now bring it into the government and say, this is how we must interface, how we must interact. I know Rich will talk a little bit more about that as well. And I think there's a common misnomer maybe in some circles that it's a ruleless society. It's the Wild West. I've even heard from senior former government officials as well. And that's not true. Right. There is a rules-based international order for space. And what we are here to talk about is how we strengthen and develop more rules as necessary to be able to help the sustainability of the environment. This includes international humanitarian law. This applies for outer space, as do the 4 core UN space treaties and a number of instruments to include the Partial Test Ban Treaty, the PTBT. And the importance of international law and rules-based order, along with the need for responsible behavior, sets us, I believe, apart from some of our strategic competitors. We do have strategic competitors who are pushing hypocritical and fundamentally flawed treaty proposals, and they've been doing this for a long time with respect to the placement of weapons in outer space, while at the same time behaving irresponsibly in space. And so that is a level of hypocrisy there. I'd also note that in the case of China, particularly, it still hasn't even ratified the PTBT at this point. And in the PTBT, it actually talks about the fact of, to prohibit, to prevent, and not to carry out any nuclear weapons tests, explosions, or other nuclear explosion at any place under its jurisdiction or control in the atmosphere, beyond its limits, including outer space. Right. So, I mean, that seems like an easy win right there. So as we consider mechanisms to enable new measures, maybe first talk about some of the policy tools that we're drawing upon to carry out some of these efforts here. One set of tools stems from the world of arms control. And I won't go deep into Eric's piece here, but which are generally intended to help manage strategic competition and attempt to mitigate miscalculations, misperceptions, and hopefully prevent inadvertent escalation of behavior there. These could include legally binding treaties. It could include when people think about arms control, that's what they think about, legally binding treaties. But there's more that can be done. This includes transparency and confidence building measures. I know one effort that we tried when I was back at the NSC in the past was with the Europeans, with the European Union Code of Conduct. That would have been an example of a transparency and confidence building measure there. But there's other things, there's norms, there's political commitments as well, whether unilateral, as the vice president announced, or with involving multiple parties as well. And so such arms control tools tend to be top-down driven from governments, from senior level governments through the interagency and out to other governments. But such a political commitment of restraint is, of course, a major theme of what we're talking about here. So then we've talked about now what the vice president has already said about the ban there. We are looking to establish this as a new international norm of space behavior. And she did make the call out to other nations to join along the way as well. Now, we've received a lot of positive feedback from nations, but particularly 2 nations in particular who've actually come and said, yes, we will do, we accede to the same. Not that there was ever intention to do it, but it's an important commitment to be able to show the norm of behavior there. And particularly those nations are New Zealand and Canada, who've come out and said, we will also commit to that. Now, as we move into UN committees and such, we do expect that we will hear more from more nations, and we will also be pressing that as well from those fora as well that we'll talk about a little bit later. The importance of this norm, though, I think one of the things, just kind of from the sausage making piece of it is, while we attempted this similar element of this in the Obama administration. I think what's really, really interesting and useful about this is, look, creating large debris risks all space sectors. It risks Earth observation systems, communication systems, it risks human space flight, it risks all this commercial space economy that's emerging in every orbital regime. And last but not least, of course, it risks national security as well. It's indiscriminate when debris hits, right? And we know that, and I think the world knows that as well. Also, this norm particularly is unique because, as we parse through the language and everything, I'm building up to this element here is it's verifiable, it's attributable. There's very little ambiguity about who done it, where, when, and so on and so forth. And I think that's a very important thing when you start thinking about things. You could talk about things like, hey, we should do things, but how would you know that? Right? And you can spend a lot of time or you can spend a lot of money to develop those capabilities, but what are those priorities? And so we think that this was a very good initial movement from the United States. And it does show positive forward momentum. It's not just a moment for discussion, but it's an actual commitment. And also I do believe it demonstrates U.S. leadership to say we will take the first step, and we hope you will join us along. With respect to principles and rules, a major ongoing effort began under the last administration was the Artemis Accords. Grounded in the Outer Space Treaty, the Artemis Accords is a multilateral, non-legally binding declaration of principles and rules to enhance governance and responsible exploration and use of space beyond geosynchronous orbit. As we start thinking about a cislunar economy, as we start thinking about going, we think about the Artemis program, we think about commercial investments to the moon, we think about even tourism and such. Like, how do you develop a rules-based element for that? I think the Artemis Accords is a really good step to be able to enable those kind of areas there. Their principles include registration of space objects, deconfliction of activities, release of scientific data, and provision of emergency assistance. You would imagine that these would be things of common sense, but it's important to put it on paper. It's important for people to commit and agree to. So we're really proud of the countries that have signed up to this. As of today, 21 nations have signed up to the Artemis Accords, and we hope more will sign as we continue to move around the world and people understand the importance of what the Accords are talking about there. And it really is a remarkable group. It's a diverse set of nations. It's not just your standard spacefaring nations. There's a lot of different nations, aspiring nations, as well as existing spacefaring nations who understand the importance of that space domain there. And this impressive array of nations, I think it illustrates a shared interest among the globe, participating in the next major phase of space exploration, in promoting a responsible use of space as a rules-based order for international society, and in further developing the economies via our space economy there. So fundamental to these rules, principles, standards, and best practices are the incredible strides being taken by so many of you out in the audience, and particularly by our private sector, our industry. Your efforts are growing to promote the responsible and peaceful and sustainable exploration and use of outer space. In the past, it may have just been the government, but now it's a partnership with the private sector as well. As our space priorities framework actually notes, we need to work with industry and international partners to lead the development and implementation of open, transparent, and credible international standards, policies, practices that establish the foundation for our global space activities along the way. And I know the importance of engagement with the private sector, and I know Richard will talk more about that in his piece there. And this is an area where promoting participation is actually bottoms up. It really is organic to the private sector saying we need to come together to be able to develop these capabilities because it's in our shared best interest from a space economy perspective. Such efforts are significant for the private sector to advance U.S. goals as well in both multilateral fora as well as in efforts to ensure interoperability between U.S. and allied partner space capabilities, including in areas like space domain awareness, space flight safety, and secure broadband satellite communications. U.S. industry is essential for our engagement in the international partnership world. And while I do have to leave right after these remarks, I will get a recording of this because I do want to hear what not that I don't want to hear you guys, but I know what you're going to say. I want to hear what the industry is going to say there as well. So I'm looking forward to getting some of those remarks there. And look, ultimately, and several of us, Scott and others have said this, rules are made by people who show up. And that's the important part here is we're showing up. We're showing up from the government perspective. We're showing up from the academic and think tank perspective. We're showing up from the industry perspective. And I think that's a form of leadership. It's a very visible and credible form of leadership as well. And all of our Artemis partners are showing up. As you sign up, you're showing up these capabilities. So fundamental to these renewed efforts is a renewed engagement to commit to international fora, including across a range of multilateral fora. I know many in the room are familiar with these, to include the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, COPUOS, which is in Vienna, the Conference on Disarmament, which is in Geneva, the UN General Assembly in New York, and the Open Ending Working Group, which I think is the next one is in Geneva as well. Got it. So clearly we go to high rent districts to have these meetings. So, it is, and of course, let's we forget as well, is the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union as well. However, multilateral fora, I think, as we know, are only one part of the equation as well. Great importance are the various unilateral and multilateral initiatives that we have outside of these multilateral fora. I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about one that's very near and dear to me, which is the Quad. The Quad is US, India, Australia, and Japan. And within the Quad, there's a lot of different working groups. And last year, the president agreed to a space working group that is co-chaired by me and then a partner from each of the different countries there. And one of those efforts that we are working with the Quad actually is to consult on norms, guidelines, principles, and rules for ensuring long-term sustainability of the outer space environment. And so when the president went to Japan earlier this year, this was one of those elements that was raised as well amongst many other areas, climate, STEM, and so on and so forth. So, but space is a very important element of the Quad. As a matter of fact, not only is there a discussion about norms in our space working group, we also have a climate working group where space is an inherent contributor, as we all know, to climate. Then also there is now a new one with respect to maritime domain awareness, which we also know the important value that space provides to that. So we are an overlapping Venn diagram of different initiatives, whether we're talking norms, climate, and maritime domain awareness. And we're continuing to reinforce in that Quad working group the hard-won bottoms-up achievement, particularly in the UN committee and in COPUOS in particular. So as you'll hear from the government speakers, we continue to move forward on the sustainable development piece. Also, State Department, DOD, the NSC are also actively evaluating new proposals and activities, and hopefully they'll read your paper as well and look for new ideas that we're trying to conceive, because I think this is a first step but not a last step of where we're going with respect to norms of behavior here. We do hope that the open-ended working group in Geneva that's meeting through August of 2023 to advance this work that we are talking about here. So as we use this, we can use those types of fora to be able to further articulate and amplify the messages and initiatives that we have here in the country. Our efforts on norms, however, go beyond national security systems and also seek to encompass all space activities. In the space priorities framework, we also noted that the United States will foster policy and regulatory environment that enables a competitive and burgeoning U.S. commercial space sector. And particularly, U.S. regulations must provide clarity and certainty for the authorization and continuing supervision of novel, non-government novel space activities. And these are things that, we're starting to see actually come to fruition now. We're talking about things like on-orbit servicing, talking about orbital debris removal, space-based manufacturing, of course, commercial space stations, recovery and use of space resources. And we're working on that now. We've started that initiative. For those that were paying attention last, I guess a week and a half ago now, so a week last Friday in Oakland, the Vice President announced that we are partnering with the interagency, with departments and agencies to begin this process to determine what this type of framework would look like. We will be reaching out to the private sector as well to receive your input. I've said this many times, your input is incredibly valuable, and particularly as it affects your industry, we need to make sure that we hear you directly. And it allows us to demonstrate the importance, while we're doing these, of the sustainability of the space environment at the same time. This mindset is concurrent with our existing regulatory agencies. So when you think about Department of Commerce, FCC, and FAA, they also are thinking about the importance of the sustainable environment through their respective regulatory mechanisms as well. And this will be a conversation that will continue. On September 9th, we will have the next National Space Council meeting that the Vice President will chair, and we'll be having this conversation a little bit more in depth as well. Last, I'd like to talk about is a range of consultations that we're working on with other non-government expert communities and international partners to identify and then promote emerging best practices. For example, in the area of space flight safety that my team is already working on, I would like to welcome, is on space flight safety and space sustainability. And one area is on uncontrolled reentry events. this work that my team's working on right now is rather timely. That the Chinese have now conducted 3 reentries in recent years of their stage for the Long March 5B. As NASA Administrator Bill Nelson actually noted in his statement on the most recent reentry, and I'll quote him here, the PRC did not share specific trajectory information as their Long March 5B rocket fell back into the Earth. All spacefaring nations should follow established best practices and do their part to share this type of information in advance to allow reliable prediction of potential debris impact risk, especially for heavy lift vehicles like the Long March 5B, which can carry a significant risk of loss of life and property. Doing so is critical to the responsible use of space and to ensure the safety of people here on Earth. That was from the NASA administrator just not too long ago. Look, China's, opaqueness on these controlled events is inherently orthogonal to the international chorus for a sustainable space environment that we're hearing. And so we need to be able to address these types of issues. And so I know the team is working amongst many people to be able to figure out, what do we do this? How do we do this within forms like copious, and how do we develop guidelines, are observed, the copious guidelines are observed, so such incidents don't occur. And if they do, they're executed in a transparent manner there. And then in the area of space sustainability, a couple of things that are ongoing right now that you should be aware of. The U.S. is already, I hope you are aware, a world leader in standards with topics with our U.S. government orbital debris mitigation standards practice, or ODMSP. We love our acronyms. And we continue to want to maintain that leadership as well. One action, though, that I think maybe you may, I don't know if you caught or not, but this past July, in OSTP's orbital debris implementation plan, we did insert the need for reevaluation of ODMSP. And I believe NASA is the one that will be leading that effort, I think. Yep. So, and this includes deorbit guidelines to better understand the impact of changing deorbit requirements for the United States government, and specifically the potential benefits and cost and reducing deorbit timelines there. And so we are evaluating those right now. So I do look forward to seeing the study and seeing what we can do to better implement and have a more sustainable space environment. And of course, there's the copious long-term sustainability efforts, which is far too much. And I just gotta make sure I keep on time because I got to say a slightly important meeting coming up here in a few minutes. So I'd like to close in a couple of things here on the way ahead. I do want to call, look, on the many experts here, we can talk about this a lot. We have talked about this a lot. What's really awesome, if I may reflect back to the opening of my speech here, is the moment we live in right now. The opportunity to effect change, the opportunity that we have people coming into the government who have the experience, both from the outside and in, to be able to affect this change. The fact that we have so many, I look around, we have so many international partners in here and online listening to this, and the opportunity to partner and be able to drive this change. If I may loosely quote Robin's paper, part of this is being able to get a group of people to look at things and say, yes, we agree upon that. And if somebody's orthogonal to that, say, what type of repercussion, condemnation, reactions do you get for something like that? And this includes things, whether we're talking about space domain awareness, space traffic management, space flight safety, communications, mission disposal, and so on and so forth. So I do apologize that I do have to run here, but I want to thank you, first of all, for everybody except Robin for taking the time to listen to me. What you don't know is I said, she's sitting there, she's like, I wrote 24 pages. He said 23. So she's trying to figure out what that one page was. So no, it is a really excellent paper. This is a really timely topic for everybody to discuss. And again, thank you guys for taking the time to be out here and engaging. And again, thanks to GW and Aerospace for hosting us again. So thank you guys very much.
Thank you. And so this is one of the benefits of being 4 blocks away from the White House, that when I asked for him to be able to speak, he doesn't have much of an excuse because it's short, because he can get back in time for another meeting. And again, your life is not your own. We understand. Thank you very much. Okay. No, that was terrific. And again, apologies for the schedule, but I thought it would be better to have Chirag here. and you can hear from him in person and the range of things that he has going on. So what I want to do now is take a 15-minute break so you can chat with folks that you were chatting with when you came in and continue. That is some of the more important part of these meetings. We will pick up in 15 minutes. I'll call folks back and we'll kick off with our first panel of government experts. Thank you. But this is sort of a mini interagency meeting, if you will. We have defense and state and NASA and commerce, all the sort of the major players in this. Richard and I probably will have some flashbacks over this because we did our own experiences in the interagency process years ago. And when I was working for Richard in the Commerce Department, we got a phone call from a senior nonproliferation guy at DOD, and he was upset with us and he was yelling at us. And as he was yelling at us over the speakerphone, he said, "Look, you guys at Commerce really aren't very powerful." And Richard and I look at each other and go, "Yeah, what's new about that?" And then there's this pause and he says, "But you're outthinking everyone else at the table." And so we were dissed and complimented at the same time. So the merits of the interagency process. But as Chirag was saying, particularly our first speaker, Travis Langster, has a long experience in industry that he brings into government. So we're fortunate to have him in that perspective. Richard has gone in and out of industry. Tom has just come back in. And so I think one of the strengths of the American system, while we do have people who are the institutional memory and stewards for long periods, as Eric was referred to, which is incredibly important, it's also important to kind of bring in new thoughts and new ideas and to have a certain vitality between government and industry. And so although this is the government panel, it is not solely a government panel. With that, I turn it over. Travis, would you like to speak up here or you want to from the seat? Your call. Okay. Travis Langster.
There we go. All righty. Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Dr. Ayers and George Washington Space Policy Institute. I would like to make an observation of my own. Chirag had his own observations. I think he really left because I don't often get the opportunity to correct him on something. So I do want to correct him on a small piece. So this is actually my first time in government after 20 plus years in commercial. And I just like to say it's an honor to be able to represent the Department of Defense. Had lots of questions coming into this public sector job, but I just want to say there's some really strong professionals, particularly in my office in the policy shop, but I was really pleasantly surprised about the professional, passionate, and just dedicated folks within the Department of Defense. So that's the observation I like to make. So I'd like to start by really, Chirag mentioned the commitment that the Vice President made earlier this year. I'd like to explain some of the thinking and policy direction that led to this announcement. before I turn to my colleague, Eric DeSaltes from the State Department. So overall, the President's March 2021 interim national security strategic guidance directs the United States will lead in promoting shared norms and forge new agreements in emerging technologies and space. The U.S. Space Priorities Framework echoed this language, indicating that as space activities evolve, the norms, rules, and principles that guide outer space activities also must evolve. The United States will lead in responsible, peaceful, and sustainable exploration and use of outer space. During the December 2021 National Space Council meeting, Vice President Harris stated that we should develop a national security perspective on what should be international rules and norms. Now, as Scott Pace knows, this direction isn't new or unique to this current administration, but it does come with some renewed emphasis and support. The December 2020 National Space Policy directs U.S. government departments and agencies that the enhancement of stability, security, and long-term sustainability in space by promoting a framework for responsible behavior in outer space, including the pursuit and effective implementation of best practices, standards, and norms of behavior. We can trace these objectives back even further, recognizing this as an administration vision, which by design is aspiration-oriented. It's worth spending a moment to consider why DoD sees space-related rules and norms as being in our interest. The evolving nature of global space activities has the potential to create significant challenges for the safety and security of space operations, as well as for the sustainability and stability of the space domain overall. Developing a shared understanding among states of what constitutes safe and responsible space activities benefits all operators, including the DoD. As a military organization, as one of the world's most experienced space operators, the Department of Defense has a special responsibility to articulate what we mean by responsible behavior and reflect those values in our operations. Adherence to common guidelines for space operations creates a more stable and predictable space environment. For DoD, a shared understanding of what constitutes responsible behavior in outer space by all sectors would enable indications and warnings of potential threats to U.S. and allied partners. Whether a particular space operations follows such common standards would be the factor that commanders could consider when determining whether behavior that appears abnormal is merely an aberration or is actually a demonstration of hostile intent or a hostile act. Making concrete proposals within the international venues, negotiating standards of behavior raises the likelihood that U.S. policies and practices will garner widespread support internationally and will then serve as a baseline for standards and guidelines in the international community ultimately. More practically, given the increased tension with Russia and China overall, we hope that advancing a shared understanding, norms, and responsible behaviors in space can enable risk reduction measures, increase transparency, and therefore overall enhanced stability. This is why the DoD has been and intends to continue being an active participant in efforts to develop and refine norms. As Chirag stated, in April, the Vice President announced the U.S. commitment not to conduct destructive direct anti-satellite missile testing. Following the global outcry about China and Russia's respective tests in 2007 and this past November, such a commitment addresses one of the most pressing threats to the security and stability of space. This language is intended to meet the following objectives. First, meaningfully limit the debris creation of new orbital debris beyond what is generated through normal operations, be easily understandable to the international community without challenging definitions, be consistent with U.S. policy positions on space arms control, and preserve the national security interests of the United States and our allies and partners. We believe this commitment is clear and understandable and has the ability to emerge as a norm of behavior in space, which would be able to be a cornerstone in the space security environment for how countries behave responsibly. Now, there have been some questions on what the benefits or whether or not it hamstrings the U.S. So let me try to hit those off now. So why does the commitment not reference degree? So we recognize that all routine space operations generate some level of debris. Moreover, quantifying or trying to add adjectives such as harmful or dangerous creates subjectivity. What do I mean by destructive? The term describes direct-ascent anti-satellite missile testing that creates fragments from the breakup of a satellite. Another question is, does the commitment put the United States at a disadvantage? It does not. The norm is not focused on technological capability, it's focused on a behavior. So this is not just a space security, it's not just about space security, but about underpinning the long-term ability to continue human exploration, to observe the Earth from space, to communicate around the world through space, and to expand new and novel economic uses of space, such as in orbit servicing and assembly. Finally, I'd like to address what's next from DoD perspective as a military organization. Again, this is meant to articulate what we mean by responsible behavior and to reflect those values in our operations. To that end, we will work with our Department of State colleagues to gain additional support and gain additional commitments from other nations in regards to this norm. Last July, as a first step to outlining the types of norms and responsible behaviors that DoD would like to see, Secretary Austin issued clarifying guidance for DoD operators, the tenets of responsible behavior in space, which are 5 key tenets that describe our longstanding operational practices. Although these tenets were meant for DoD space operators, it's our hope that they could be a start of a useful conversation among military operators worldwide in order to build a shared understanding of responsible behaviors. We're continuing to iterate on these tenets to elaborate upon specific examples of behavior that we seek to follow during our operations and anticipate continuing to share these ideas with military partners and other space operators. With that, I'll turn to my colleague from State Department.
I'll just add that we'll have a series of statements, and then I'm going to shift toward asking questions, either the panel, questions of people here in the room, and also people sending questions over chat. Now I'll just do the Q&A option. Go through a statement first, and we'll turn to Q&A.
All right, thanks very much, Scott. I don't know that I've ever been called the institutional memory before. I feel like having worked with Chirag when he was on the National Security Council, and then Scott when he was the executive secretary, and now Chirag again. I guess that qualifies as being around a long time while everybody else has left and I've just sat in one place. I will say right off the start, one of the really interesting things is the shift in Scott from being in government where words mattered to being out of government where it's like, whatever this commitment thing is, you guys can all parse the language on that because it's very interesting. It's not a kinetic energy ASAT moratorium. We don't use the word kinetic energy. It's any direct ascent ASAT missile tests. Now I admit we've really struggled with the shorthand for it. The DDAAMT or D2A2MT really doesn't make for a great acronym. Potentially a word you would use if somebody conducted a direct ascent ASAT test that caused debris. But I don't think we're going to go there and use that as our phrasing. So we're still struggling on that. So I'd welcome ideas on that if people have it. Now, Chirag has actually talked a lot about what I was going to mention today, but I'll just try to add a few additional points related to how we're going to take that process forward. And so Travis really did a good job of explaining why the norm is in our national security interest. And I want to talk about what are we going to do to get other countries to sign up? Because it's one thing to announce a unilateral commitment, but there's a lot of work that is required to develop that shared understanding of the commitment and get broad international acceptance of it as a norm of responsible behavior. Once again, pointing to Robin, how do we build that norm momentum? And I think we've got a plan. We'll see how that works out. And then after that, I'll cover a couple of ideas that we have for additional norms of behavior that we might consider proposing at future multilateral events. So first and most importantly, related to this commitment, we timed the vice president's announcement in order to spur a meaningful discussion at the open-ended working group on reducing space threats through norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior. Very long title, but that's sort of UN speak for you, which met the week of May 9th in Geneva. So the vice president announced the commitment on April 18th, and then by May 8th, we were in Geneva, May 9th, we were in Geneva meeting in this multilateral body. So the OEWG, which it is known as, invites all UN member states over the next 2 years with the goals of, quote, make recommendations on possible norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior relating to threats by states to space systems, including as appropriate, how they would contribute to the negotiation of a legally binding instrument, including on the prevention of an arms race in outer space. And so with that as a goal, having a norm that we could propose on our own was really important. First, as Chirag mentioned, it allowed the United States to demonstrate our leadership in this area. Second, it allowed us to drive the conversation in a way that supports our position that norms are the way to go, especially in the face of other proposals, such as was discussed this Russia and Chinese draft treaty. It's known as the Treaty on the Prohibition of the Placement of Weapons in Space and the Threats and Use of Force Against Objects in Space. The bottom line with that is it's really been designed to constrain the United States while allowing Russia and China to do the things that they want to do. And then finally, this commitment was a way to demonstrate to the states at the open-ended working group that progress could be made on these important space security issues, even if it was just a first step. And I think the timing and our use of the norm did exactly as we planned. Super fortunate to represent the United States at the open-ended working group. We had great discussions around our norm. The chair's summary actually reflects the discussion. It states a number of delegations expressed particular concern about the testing of direct-ascent anti-satellite missiles. They at least got the phrasing right, like Scott, including tests that create long-lasting debris. We received supporting comments. As Chirag mentioned, Canada used the open-ended working group to announce that they were going to follow the same commitment. And New Zealand also did the same shortly thereafter. I think what was clear is that there was a shared concern in the room regarding the indiscriminate nature of the debris created by ASAT missile testings, even if some of those countries weren't comfortable criticizing countries that had done debris generating ASAT tests. So as background, for the next steps, depending on the feedback that we get from allies and partners over the next couple of months, there are two approaches we may take to multilateralize this commitment. First, we could seek a non-binding UN General Assembly resolution. The General Assembly starts meeting in September, basically runs all the way through December, where various bodies will examine different proposals. And so the UN First Committee, the Disarmament Committee, is where the space security discussions occur. And so we could submit a resolution to that would call on all countries to not conduct such direct-ascent ASAT missile tests. Such a resolution would allow countries to go on record regarding their support, creating that shared agreement among the majority of UN member states, while increasing political pressure on countries that have plans for future ASAT tests. We could also consider making this into a legally binding arms control agreement, though I view that as a much longer term effort. Long-standing US policy states that space arms control agreements must be equitable, verifiable, and in US national security interests. And as Chirag mentioned, we believe that this specific language of this commitment would allow activity in contravention of it to be observed and to be attributed. And so it meets some of those criteria. So beyond that, let me turn to some thoughts on other next steps. First, the open-ended working group will hold its second meeting the week of September 12th in Geneva. The second meeting will address, quote, current and future threats by states to space systems and actions, activities, and omissions that could be considered irresponsible. The first week, we spent a lot of time talking about the legal framework. Now we're going to shift into what countries see as threats. And regarding that first week, I thought the discussions we had were substantive. with engagement from a wide variety of states. It wasn't just the United States and Russia or China. The chair called the week positive and successful, which I think is really great. The chair's summary also noted some of the important areas of commonality, such as the application of international law to outer space, including the UN Charter. It also noted some of the really interesting discussions we had around the term due regard in the context of space security. So both this first and second meeting are designed to set up the third meeting in January 2023, where the OEWG will discuss possible norms, rules, and principles of behavior. The United States recognizes that there is scope for the development of additional norms beyond our direct-ascent ASAT missile testing commitment. Those could form the foundation for habits of trust and cooperation between operators in the space environment and reduce the risks of operating in space or the risk of conflict extending into outer space. For example, we recognize that our ASAT commitment doesn't cover all ASAT threats, including space-based ASAT systems. While we think it is important to take the first step now to address that most pressing threat, we think the open-ended working group is an excellent forum for developing a shared understanding and concepts to address some of those other threats. The US submission to the UN Secretary General in April 2021, which was an interagency approved document, lists some of those areas we hope to discuss at the open-ended working group, including enhancing communication between operators of national security satellites, developing best practices or responsible behaviors regarding safe and professional operation of national security satellites, developing commitments around avoiding purposeful interference with satellite command and control systems, and elaborating best practices or responsible behavior that avoids simulating or testing ASAT weapons in the direction of or in close proximity to another state's satellite. So let me close by saying we look forward to working cooperatively with the international community to identify, develop, and implement voluntary, non-binding norms of responsible behavior over the coming years that can help minimize the impact of counter space activities. These norms can also build upon past and ongoing efforts in other fora and will help preserve the outer space environment for the benefit and use of all countries, while strengthening a rules-based international order for space. Thank you for the opportunity to give remarks this morning, and I look forward to answering any questions.
First few now. Even academic.
Hello, there we go. So first off, thanks to Scott and Jamie, GW Aerospace for having me, and also apologies. I was a little late because I was coming from a red eye from LA. I don't sleep very well on planes, so I'm running on coffee right now, and I might talk a little bit quickly. That's the caffeine driving. So, you know, apologies if I stumble at all. Also, it's going to be a little bit of a right turn from what we've been talking about here, because I'm coming from NASA, representing NASA, and we, you know, the ASAT stuff is not quite our bailiwick, but space sustainability and debris very much is. And so I want to focus my remarks more towards that without directly talking about the ASAT policies, except to note that it's a great step to reduce the creation of new debris in outer space. And we, you know, strongly applaud that. So instead, I want to focus a bit more on some civil space stuff related to debris sustainability and focusing on the, like, what next, right? So for space sustainability, and then within that, I'm going to scope to my own sort of personal expertise related to debris remediation. So what might we be able to do about debris that's already up there, and what else do we need to know before we can start to craft new norms or policies related to debris remediation? So before that, I want to take just two big steps backwards and kind of contextualize the problem a little bit. I know we all sort of know why we care about orbital debris, but I'm going to review it just real quickly anyways. There are three main reasons why we care about orbital debris. First, most obviously, you might get struck, right? Like if you're a satellite in orbit, this could degrade your capability. It might even kill you, right? The satellite, not the operator. And so if you are a government-owned satellite performing a government mission, not only did you lose that asset, but also all of the people who depend on the services that provide, they now have degraded or lost service, and there's costs associated with that. These risks can be measured in dollars. Likewise, for commercial companies, they lose the services or they're degraded. people are affected not only at the companies who've lost revenue, but the people who depend on these types of services like crop monitoring or, rural internet, they may lose their services, and there are costs associated with this. And you're going to see, I'm going to try to hammer home, I think we need to think about debris in terms of dollars. So what else might there be? If you don't get hit, there's still a lot of costs that might be imposed upon you. So if you have a high probability conjunction, you have to spend a decent amount of labor power to do the in-depth risk analysis to understand whether or not you might need to maneuver. If so, how do you coordinate with others? That's labor power that costs people time and money. If you do decide to do the maneuver, you're going to possibly use propellant. You may not use it very much, but you do it enough, you're depleting your overall operational lifetime, because once that spacecraft runs out of gas, it's done. Setting aside the propellant issue, while you are maneuvering, you may, depending on what your mission is, not be able to perform your mission. It might be very difficult to take pictures while you are in the midst of maneuvering. You might maneuver yourself out of your operational envelope, and in some cases, it could be many days before you are able to get back into your operational slot to resume operations. So this is days of lost mission. And then there's a ton more. I'm only going to mention one more, which is uncontrolled re-entry at the end of life. As a object comes in, it may cause damage or loss of life to people on the ground. And as I'm sure everyone knows, the liability convention says that the launching state is absolutely liable for any damage that's caused. So the taxpayers are on the hook for our stuff when it comes down, no matter where it comes down or what we tried to do to mitigate those risks. So those are the operational costs at a high level. There are two other reasons why we care about debris. The operational stuff is near term. Longer term, kind of a disaster scenario. We all know the Kessler effect. I won't spend any time on it, but basically chain reaction, debris turns into more debris, and then you can't really use space anymore, right? Long term, can't really quantify that in dollars necessarily. And the third is sort of a philosophical argument, which is in any other domain, if you see someone generating trash, you're like, well, maybe you shouldn't generate that trash, right? Or if you did generate that junk, well, maybe you should pick that up, right? Like do something about it. So there's a responsibility argument that can be used as well. So I mention these simply because I want to use that to frame some comments about debris remediation and how I feel like we may need to think about debris a little bit differently moving forward. So what is debris remediation? Debris is already up there. It's causing operational risks to other satellite operators. What do you do about it? How do you reduce the risk? Think of it in risk. And when I say risk, I really mean dollars, eventually expected dollars. There are three types of things that you could do. You could move the debris from a high risk orbit to a lower risk orbit. You could remove the debris, deorbit it, pull it out of the space environment, or you could reuse the debris, right? So you could salvage it or do some sort of recycling. I think when we generally, especially in America, think about debris remediation, we're thinking about grabbing pieces of debris and bringing them down, deorbiting. But that's generally because people focus on arguments related to Kessler syndrome and related to responsibility, where we're thinking about individual pieces of debris and reducing the particle count. But if we shifted to think more about what are the actual operational impacts measured in dollars to government and commercial systems, then the question becomes, well, what can we do to reduce risk and to reduce cost, not necessarily to reduce the number of pieces of debris in space? And this is where I think it would open up many different types of remediation capabilities and requires us to think a little bit more about the operational effects. You had mentioned before, you didn't talk about good debris, bad debris, whatever, because it introduces subjectivity. And it introduces subjectivity because we haven't really done the due diligence to put a lot of the numbers behind what the effects might be. Why should we do it now? Because if you look across US industry and across the US government and many of the activities of our international partners around the world, there appears like there may be a window of opportunity for some sort of policy change, and whether that's a norm or what, there is some momentum building across the globe for nations to do something about debris remediation. What that is exactly, don't know yet. But I think that's what I want to focus the remainder of my remarks on, is what do we need to know in order to have one of the what's next things be some sort of policy or norm related to debris remediation. And so this is two things, right? I'm just hammering the operational risk stuff. We have all of this anecdata, right? So after the Russian ASAT test, the risk to the ISS of being struck by debris doubled, right? So we know that. NASA's robotic spacecraft, we are now experiencing a 30% increase in high-risk events that we have to respond to. We're up to about 4 high interest events per day that we have to try to adjudicate. And as I said before, this is people power, analysts spending all their time trying to figure out what we should do about it. Maybe you also saw SpaceX recently announced that the Starlink constellation had to maneuver 1,700 times, 1,700 to avoid Russian ASAT debris. So we have this anecdote, but none of that was in dollars, was it, right? So the space industry has not yet, and I should say like enterprise, has not yet gone that next step and said, okay, well, how much did those maneuvers actually cost, right? Because it may not cost Starlink much of anything. They're maneuvering all the time, right? So you have to try to quantify what the operational effects are. I would argue in terms of dollars if possible. Aggregate that up to an industry-wide level and then figure out, well, what's debris worth to us? How much is it hurting us? And once we know what it's worth, how much it's hurting us, we can start to talk about how we might try to reduce those costs and make smart decisions about what to do there. So this is why I think we should focus more on operational risks. Let me just check what my time is so I don't go too far over. But while we are, boom, okay, I still got a little bit. So then if we start to think not about just removing pieces of debris, but how do we reduce cost, reduce risk? Now all of a sudden, these other types of debris remediation come into the trade space. So imagine that you've got 2 large pieces of debris that might be coming at each other. Instead of trying to remove one, because you never know, once you have a high impact collision being likely, you could just nudge them out of the way and avoid the collision, avoid creating the debris. And if you'd done the foundational research around cost that I had just been talking about, you'd know how much that was worth. You'd know how much you might be willing to pay to do something like that. Some people say at a policy level, that's just a Band-Aid. It's not really solving the problem because those pieces of big debris are still up there. But I would say it's not a Band-Aid, it's a tourniquet. And we shouldn't allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good if the operational costs are actually becoming intolerable. Also, there are other potentials. So if you have a fragmentation event, a lot of the debris will remain somewhat in a cloud, somewhat localized for a period of time, 48, 72 hours. If you could rendezvous with that quickly, you might be able to scoop up a very large fraction of that debris, thereby approximately erasing the negative effects that that collision would have created. And I think if we take a more operational risk perspective and think about reducing risk, it opens up the trade space for these ideas. Now, big caveat, I'm not saying any of this stuff is going to work. It's all very low TR, low maturity. We don't really understand the costs of developing it. We don't necessarily understand how effective this stuff would be. But if we can answer the question about, or if we can pay more attention to the larger trade space and focus on thinking about risk more quantitatively and have that be a goal, these are the 2 things that I think we need to take advantage of the window of opportunity that may be emerging to do something within the country and more globally about debris remediation. So to me, that's kind of my pitch for why I think that might be a future norm policy and what we need to solve in the near term to take advantage of that opportunity. So thanks.
I'm more intelligent if you leave the microphone off. Did I get that? All right, very good. We don't really do arms control down at the Commerce Department. So I've been listening as the conversation has rolled down to me. It's changed and morphed a little bit. So I get to say pretty much whatever I want at this point. Let me start with this rather bland observation that knowledge is essential to good decision making. That's kind of the business that we're going to be in. I'm going to explain that in a moment. So at the Commerce Department, we have this little office of Space Commerce. Started out a couple of crazy guys, Scott Pace, Rich Delvello, were mostly just spending their time annoying people in the traditional aerospace establishment. but it's grown. I was out with the vice president last weekend for the event in Oakland, and it was kind of a celebration of the technical prowess and success of the U.S. commercial space industry. And I was reflecting, Scott, how tentative the whole thing seemed when we started. The idea of commercial space seemed to some people laughable. And you fast forward 30 years and you look at the behemoth that the industry has become, really the global phenomena. Commercial entrepreneurs everywhere in the world innovating, coming up with the most amazing things, and to see this industry. And I just wanted to start by saying that was not an accident. That was a decades-long bipartisan collaboration between administrations and the US Congress to support and to come up with sensible regulations, to come up with occasionally innovative ways to do funding. And the result has been an amazing growth, hundreds of billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars of great jobs. So I think it's useful sometimes to take a step back and say that the future didn't have to look like it looks today. These are decisions we made that were good decisions, and we stuck to them. And so we are at a kind of an inflection point now, and we're looking forward. And I see the same kind of tremendous dynamism going forward. There is so much potential out there, and so many incredible new businesses can be established in low Earth orbit, in communications, in different kinds of imaging, and lunar prospecting, and other things that will soon be realities. But I get ahead of myself. Who are we? Office of Space Commerce, three main jobs. First of all, we're an advocate for industry, and it's something that we've been proudly doing for over 30 years. We're also a regulator. We regulate the US Earth remote sensing industry. We have been given the responsibility, thanks to the Space Council and Space Policy Directive 3 and the last administration, which said we're going to move commercial and civil SSA from the Defense Department to the Commerce Department. How SSA got to the Defense Department is itself a whole story, which we don't have time for this morning. Let me say that initially the Defense Department was less than enthusiastic about being nominated to provide global SSA. It was something, of course, they started out organically doing for themselves and in support of their mission. And then over time, it's sort of, they started to get more and more responsibilities, and then people started to rely on them. There was a point in the 2000s when I believe there was even a decision, we're not going to do this anymore. Congress quickly re-informed the Defense Department that that was not a good decision. And I think I was just recently out at the 18th Space Force out in Vandenberg, where they do all this magic. And, you know, they're under a lot of pressure and a lot of stress. I mean, and they are, you know, kind of looking at me and going, go faster, please, because, you know, we'd like to offload some of this stuff. For all the reasons that have already been discussed, space has become a very complicated place. National security requirements for monitoring space have also greatly expanded. And so part of what the Defense Department needs to do is offload some of those responsibilities so that they can focus on their core missions. We'll always have a strong partnership, just as we have a partnership with NASA CARA, which is an amazing organization out in Goddard, led by Laura Newman, who they do, you know, they really are sort of the platinum standard of SSA for the nation, and do an amazing job always. So we're looking forward to working with all of those folks. So we are at the very beginning of our process. We are, this year, we'll be doing some fundamental tasks. We're going to be starting to buy commercial data. We're going to be doing some pilot programs to demonstrate commercial capabilities. We're going to be establishing a baseline. We're going to be replicating what the 18th can do so that we have a baseline to compare other things for. These are all 22, 23 activities. We're hiring. For those of you looking for jobs, please feel free to check out usa.gov. We always have jobs openings. We're trying to grow a small staff to like 35 people next year. Also, they called, and the only thing I can complain about, Scott, is he left me with this program called OADR, which sounds kind of like a medical problem. And so my own little personal contest, if anyone can come up with a better name for the program, lunch anywhere in DC that you want on me. All right. So we have a naming opportunity here. I'm running my own personal contest because I cannot figure out how to do anything that complicated at the Department of Commerce. The acquisition system is truly amazing. So we're going to be doing a lot of stuff this year, and hopefully the goal is to start offloading pieces of the DoD's responsibility as soon as we can. So we'll likely start with the easy stuff and move to the hard stuff. Easy stuff is GEO, hard stuff definitely is LEO. So we're probably going to do that in some kind of, we're going to try to do that in an organized fashion so that we can make an impact. A couple of comments about norms of behavior. I think we will have a role in norms of behavior because back to my initial statement, knowledge is essential to making decisions. If you don't have exquisite understanding of where things are and what the impacts are in space, you can't make good decisions. So norms of behavior, if we look, and a lot of different approaches have been talked about here, but how do people make rules? I mean, if we go back, one of the great examples is, of course, we have tradition. The rules that exist today for admiralty and maritime law actually are like almost 3,000 years old and slowly evolved from the trading that the Greeks were doing in the Mediterranean. And it was driven by necessity, war, natural disaster, unscrupulous traders, evil, conniving port owners, all the stuff that you had to deal with in early trading started to develop a set of rules about what are the conduct of international traders. When we start trading on the moon, we will be standing on the principles that were established 3,000 years ago by the early traders. So that's, of course, one way is the broad brush of tradition. And then we have some deliberate methods. I mean, arms control is clearly where nations get together and go, we want to make rules, and we're going to start out at the top down. Artemis is kind of a hybrid. Artemis says, we would like to make rules, but we understand not everyone agrees today. But let's start with some basic principles. Some of us agree, and and anybody who agrees, come over here, and then maybe eventually the rest of the world will agree. You have the UN, which serves a tremendously valuable role in all of this policy making and in rulemaking. But as one, I think, diplomat observed, at the UN, the process is the product often. And so if you want to do something, sometimes you have to do an Artemis to move things forward. And who knows, I think we may do something like that on rules of the road for space. I'm not speaking for the United States government. I'm opining that it is logical that there may be kind of a coalition of the willing that decide that certain rules make sense. Much as the vice president announced her decision or the U.S. decision on the ASAT issue, and then other nations agreed. So I think that then there's another layer entirely of how agreement is done, and that's standardization. So to start out with a story, when I was involved a decade or so ago when the Space Data Association got set up, one of the early problems back then, it seems kind of crazy now, but geo operators, there really wasn't that much of a LEO industry at all at that time. And geo operators used to literally call each other on the phone when they were going to move a satellite and talk about and they would coordinate. And so the question was, can we do better than this? And the answer was yes, of course we can. And so but the question was, operators all had different languages. I mean, they all spoke a different technical language, because if you were at Intelsat, you grew up doing things the Intelsat way. If you were at SES or Eutelsat or someone like that, you had your sort of own organic way and processes. So one of the first things they did is have to solve the Tower of Babel problems. How do they exchange data in a meaningful way, such that when you send me something, I know what you meant? And so boiling it all down, standards, and we have, of course, the folks at NIST in the Department of Commerce who are experts in this area and do standards across many industries. But standards, fundamental standards, how do we communicate? How do we build the building blocks? And this is slow work. This is often industry collaboration in international fora like ISO. This is slow, painful processes that evolve over time. But that basic standard stuff creates the capability to communicate. Communication creates the ability to create knowledge, and then knowledge can lead to these higher order processes. So our role is a small one. We're kind of at we're kind of at the standard setting, rulemaking side of the things. And we look to our colleagues at State Department and other places to help us on the bigger picture, the large rules of the road. So our goal this year and going on is to help create a new tool. NASA will not go away. DoD will not go away. Their roles in SSA will continue because they have an exquisite need. I always liken it to the needs of the intelligence community are a lot different than the needs of a commercial Earth observation company. And there will always be a need for exquisite SSA. And then what we need to put in place is a free product, a basic service that allows people to operate safely. And also that will create the knowledge that will inform things like policies for next generation rules of the road. So we are a cog in this very important machinery of the government. And I look forward to working with you all.
So one of the things that comes to mind, and maybe this is quick sort of moderator privilege, in the arms control world, we talk about various criteria, like in the national space policy, mutually beneficial, verifiable, all those kinds of criteria, which really go back to Reagan. Do we apply those kind of criteria to norms, or do we hold norms to lesser or different standards, or are they simply orthogonal to that? How should we think about norms relative to the kind of criteria we think about for arms control?
Thanks for that question, Scott. So when we do talk about arms control, we talk about verification. So I'm from the Bureau of Arms Control, Verification and Compliance. It's one of the big issues we work on is how do we verify legally binding arms control agreements and commitments. And a lot of work is done on verification. If you look at the nuclear reduction treaties we have with the Russians, those verification provisions run hundreds of pages. It talks about what happens when an inspector shows up at a port of entry and all the steps necessary to get them to the point where they're actually doing that. We're a long way away from that in space, obviously. But when it comes to non-legally binding, non-binding commitments, such as norms, we don't talk about verification with a big V. We actually talk about the ability to observe and attribute those activities because it is a bit of a lesser standard. You're not legally bound by that commitment. You can be acting in contravention to that commitment. That's one of the reasons we like norms, is that if the situation changes, if somebody is not following a norm, it's not like being stuck in a legally binding treaty. It's a lot easier to just say, all right, you're not abiding by your commitments. We are not going to also abide by those commitments. So there is a bit of a lesser standard when it comes to that. But at the same time, as we said, this ASAT proposal by the Vice President, it is observable. It is in our national security interest. It does meet those criteria in the national space policy, the 2020 space policy that you ably shepherded through the system. And so we think that's potentially why you could turn this into a legally binding arms control. And as we think about other norms of responsible behavior, they are norms of behavior because norms of behavior is easier to observe. I don't necessarily understand intent. Defining what a weapon in space is really very challenging. We haven't gotten to that point yet. The dual use problem because of those things. I don't want to disrupt the work of companies like Astroscale because they could be considered dual use. So instead, focusing on behaviors that I can see, conducting a direct-ascent ASAT test, testing a weapon in close proximity to another country's satellite. Those are things that are observable that space domain awareness now can help us with, and that's why we're focused on those sorts of standards.
So I take it that norms, if they meet certain criteria, have a potential upgrade path for legally binding, but not necessarily.
Right, and that's one of the things we talked about with our, the Vice President's commitment is that this is a first step. There are potentially other steps that could eventually get you to a legally binding arms control agreement. But, you know, as Rich talked about, you know, these are slow, painful processes. Diplomacy doesn't move very quickly. So let's address things that we can quickly, potentially through the UN, figure out what those other are, and at some point down the road, do legally binding. And in fact, the Outer Space Treaty is a really good example of that. In 1963, there's actually a UN resolution, the UN General Assembly resolution that calls on all countries not to place nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in orbit. It's not until 67 that you actually get those points enshrined in a legally binding treaty. So it shows you, you know, do something quick, soon, and then eventually you might get to that arms control solution in the future.
I have to add that when you go into the FAA for a license, launch license, and a payload review, one of the things they look for is, are you launching a nuclear weapon? No. Good. Okay. That's not allowed. All right. Next. That. And so the way international law in that case is enforced, you know, always this question of enforcement. Well, it's enforced at the national level. It's enforced in national law and regulation. Orbital debris mitigation guidelines that are not binding are enforced, you know, at the national level in licensing. So national power does bite, but at the national level, not in transnational. But I wanted to go from that to ask then Richard. So you talk about you know, feeling licensing, you know, new things, innovative things that aren't really sort of covered. Is the FCC going to beat you to the punch?
You know, they're pretty fast, those guys. You know, so here's the lay of the land. And, you know, you can turn off the tape recorder for this one. But the FCC has an amazing process, and they've handled a lot of really complicated issues over the years. And the rest of us were kind of talking about space debris, and really it was the FCC who actually stepped forward and made some significant rules about starting the process of regulating debris creation. That being said, you know, the question is really, how do we want to do this going forward? We're at the beginning of a long journey, and so it's useful to take the time to figure out how to do this right. FAA has some responsibilities for launch and reentry. We have some responsibilities currently for Earth imaging, which curiously enough doesn't cover things like radio occultation or RF sensing. So there are a bunch of activities that the commercial sector is already doing that aren't covered by the remote sensing rules. So already these gaps have started to appear even around our authorities. And so the FCC has said recently, I think Chairwoman Rosenwortzel announced they were going to look at manufacturing in space. They had an NOI on that. And they did a really interesting, if you haven't read it, a really interesting document in 2020 which asked a bunch of fundamental questions about operator responsibility going forward, getting to the issue of the United States government is responsible if anything goes wrong. So I think the FCC has been intellectually active in a very helpful way. And I separate that from the decision, which will have to be made by the president and Congress about how are we dividing all these authorities moving forward there'll be activities and people are going to be doing radio frequency emission on the moon. I mean, is the FCC going to regulate the moon and Mars? So we're going to have the FCC Mars division. And I think that sounds kind of waggish, but it's a fundamental question, which is it's not a right or wrong answer. It's the question is, we know what issues we're going to face. How do we want to do it? Other nations have taken a completely different approach, and they've had a space authority, which has all regulatory responsibilities in one agency. And so is that a preferred? Other people have suggested perhaps there should be a space portal where all the government back channel stuff is sort of out of the public's view, and all the entrepreneur sees is a one entry portal to the government, and then they work through the portal to get whatever approvals they need. I think there are a lot of paradigms out there. And again, I am not knocking FCC. I think the intellectual work that the FCC has done is incredibly important. And they have a very rigorous process for public comment, and they have an intelligent and insightful staff. My only question is that the way we want to piecemeal this going forward, or would we like to sort of take a step back and go, okay, we know what the problems are going to be. What's the appropriate way for the United States to handle all the commercial activities going forward?
I'm looking at some questions that come in over Q&A. If anyone here has questions, please raise hand. Okay, I see people in the room get precedence over people online.
So, thank you. Brian Whedon, Secure World Foundation. So following on with the discussion we just had about this gap in oversight of commercial space, those of you who work for the Biden administration, what is the plan on mission authorization or some other approach to address that? That was the solution proposed, I think the last time, Rich, you were working in the White House during the Obama administration in response to a congressional request of how are we going to address this gap. Scott, you guys included it in the 2020 National Space Policy. So is there any discussion about efforts to help close this gap and address what Rich just laid out?
Go ahead, Travis, over to you.
No, yeah, that gap there certainly is worth discussing, and it sounds like it's a interagency type of thing to get after. And I'm sure Commerce, potentially other organizations will be part of that. So I'll leave it at
But
that.
I think specifically to your question, Diane Howard, who was just here sitting in the front row, has at Chirag's instruction initiated an interagency review. So that review is ongoing.
Hi, good morning. Dana Linnett from the Summit Group DC. I had a question about, I'm really fascinated with the remediation of debris, because we all know there's a problem. A lot of people are building technologies to track. A lot of people are building technologies to reposition and to, rethrust and so on. But I think humans are becoming an invasive species. Wherever we go, we build things, pollute things, leave it, and then go somewhere else. And I think there is an element of people in industry or even in the population who think we're just going to leave this dump on the planet that we're polluting, climate change, and just go and colonize Mars and the moon. I'm not saying that's anyone in this room. I'm just saying out there. What are the opportunities actually for recycling and reusing the debris that's in space? And you mentioned costs. I'd have to suspend belief to think you haven't been thinking about the recycling aspect, but I'd love to hear more about that and what industry might be able to do to step up with that, and whether there will be any requirements from regulators baked in on responsibilities for remediation and sustainability. So sort of a sweeping question.
Yeah, no worries. And I'll do my best. So yeah, thank you for the question. I the first question was sort of along the lines of recycling and where that's at. So before coming to NASA, I was at a place called the Science Technology Policy Institute, or the FFRDC, that supports the White House, Office of Science Technology Policy, and other councils. And so I was helping on the orbital debris R&D plan and also the implementation plan. And I ran a listening session with the community on, what should we do to implement, potential debris remediation stuff. And much to my surprise, many of the people who showed up to talk were very interested in recycling. The issue with recycling is that it is, so as I mentioned, the types of remediation capabilities that I was talking about, where maybe you could nudge debris out of the way of having collisions or different types of things, these are relatively low maturity and we don't totally understand. And in many ways, the recycling efforts are in that same category or potentially even a little bit more speculative at the time. And so one of the things too that I'm always looking for are where are people's near-term revenue streams. So if you could, nudge a piece of debris out of the way today, if you thought you were going to have a collision, I think you could probably drum up some customers who might at least entertain the idea. But if you're going to do the recycling, you have to think about who's going to buy it. Some people talk about, well, we need feedstock in space. And this, starts to overlap with the ISAM stuff, right? So who's buying feedstock, raw materials basically in space. So there are interesting things that could be done, lots of really, really cool concepts. But I think thinking a little bit nearer term, as I was sort of saying, thinking about reducing operational risk now as soon as we can, I think the recycling is a little bit further away, but I absolutely agree that it should be in the trade space. And it is also another one of these ways in which debris remediation has a lot of horizontal technology and relationships to many of the other types of technologies that we care about advancing, and which also need new types of norms and guidelines. If you're going to be doing ISAM in space, how do you make sure you don't create more debris as you're putting things together or manufacturing? And the pulling pieces of debris down, even if that, that's a very attractive technology, because even if for whatever reason it doesn't work, and there are many indications that it will and there are near-term customers, you've still got all this other satellite servicing relevant technology that you developed along the way, right? So, but I think just the recycling aspect is just a little bit further afield than some of the other types. So, but it's very important to consider.
Tom,
Thanks.
can I add one thing? This is curious how norms and tradition impact things like advanced technology, particularly on this issue of recycling. The maritime law of salvage does not apply in space because of the treaties that we have in space. You own, or the nation who was the launching state owns the object in perpetuity. So even going up and grabbing something to recycle it, even if it's junk and has been abandoned, there's no legal right to do that today. So the way we create these rules actually impacts how these technologies can develop.
Just to nerd out on that one tiny little extra bit,
Please.
I think it's not clear that you can transfer liability from one launching state to another, but we have demonstrated the transfer of space assets. So like some billionaire owns like the Soviet Lunokhod, he bought it from the Soviets, right? So we can transfer, but the liability, like what if I tried to do something with the thing you sold to me and then I mess it up, right? Like your country's still on the hook.
Right.
Going back and a little bit more history question from online, was one of the folks online noticed that Chirag mentioned that the Obama administration had considered a similar moratorium. And the question is, what prevented the unilateral commitment at that point? And then why did Vice President Harris not mention the 2008 burnt frost test in her announcement?
Oh, maybe I can chime in on that last part. Bottom line is that we recognize, well, let me get a little bit technical, that the altitude really does matter. The altitude for the Russia and Chinese ASAT, they were pretty high in altitude, which means longer lived debris, and the amount of debris that came from those two ASAT tests are still having a long lived effect and will be up there for decades. But at the end, we would not like to see any direct-ascent ASAT missile tests taking place.
Okay, to parse that. So that would mean that you wouldn't necessarily consider burnt frost an ASAT test, but because it did not create long-lived orbital debris, it was not really included in the commitment that the U.S. recently made.
I wouldn't say that it wouldn't be included, but that was for safety purposes. It was a mission to ensure that impact on the ground from a safety perspective didn't happen.
Just to, on that, uncontrolled reentry, we were talking about the Long March 5Bs. This was an uncontrolled reentry of one of our satellites that we were very concerned about. We were very transparent about our activities, very clear that this was a one-off system. This was not a planned ASAT test. It was for us trying to mitigate the potential for this problem. Now, I think we're very clear that, any future event like that would fall under this commitment. And so we will have to take that into account if we were to consider this in the future. Now, as Chirag talked about, all of these efforts build on the efforts of the past, whether it was during your time as the executive secretary or back in the Obama administration. The history is correct. We started with the European Union's Code of Conduct, as we talked about, that actually had a provision on ASAT testing. The Code of Conduct fell apart for a number of different reasons. It didn't get that international momentum going that we would have liked. There was clear interest in that debris provision, but if you actually look at the language that they had and the language that we have now in the Vice President's commitment, it's quite different. And part of that is the time that it has taken us to understand really what the concerns are. Also happens to be that we have had 2 ASAT tests in the time being between that Obama administration proposal with the Indian test and now the Russian test that have shown quite clearly what the risks are to being able to operate in space from these uncontrolled destructions that occur.
So another question is, and really to both maybe defense and state, how would you make the argument to countries who never had any intention of developing ASAT weapons that is to their benefit to sign up to the U.S. initiative? Why should they care?
I'll start. So again, it's not about the technical capability. It really is about the behavior. So this norm addresses the behavior of a destructive type of event that harms the sustainability of the space environment.
That's right. It's absolutely about building that commitment. It's even if a country doesn't plan to build an ASAT capability, we still want them to make this commitment to demonstrate that they agree that this is a norm of behavior. It's by bringing all of these voices together that we will get it established internationally as a norm of responsibility. And in the UN, every country gets a vote. And so we want all of these countries to make this commitment to build this norm into something that everybody can agree on.
Okay, so I guess one of the things that happened with the long-term sustainability of space activities, a whole bunch of people had a bunch of technical people meet. There's groups of government experts who had various expert thoughts, and that got into the system. And then we shifted to government discussions, which then after several years resulted in 21 guidelines that eventually got accepted and passed by the General Assembly, which now we're looking at implementing in national law and regulation. So we're looking at the implementation of long-term sustainability. Is that the process that you think will happen with norms? So we're not doing a treaty necessarily, and we still may have, frankly, China or Russia maybe being outliers throughout a lot of this discussion. But do you think we could get enough done through the General Assembly that we could get norms of behavior or responsible behavior more widely adopted, even if China and Russia continue to object, say at the General Assembly level?
So first of all, absolutely. You talked about the way COPIUS was done. The way we've organized the open-ended working group, or the chair has organized it, is we start every morning with panel discussions. And so experts come out and present on. Last round, we had lots of lawyers come out and present on the legal environment. We'll have lots of different non-governmental organizations talking about space threats over the coming OEWG to help build the understanding and consensus in the room about what those space threats are. Most of these people are normal diplomats who don't deal with space on a day-to-day basis. So building that shared understanding is going to be very important. And then in the UN, it's a simple majority to pass a resolution. So even if you had Russia or China voting no against something, this is not like the UN Security Council where they would have a veto. And so you could bring together a lot of countries. So the resolution that established this open-ended working group, the Russians and the Chinese voted no on it. We ended up getting 164 countries to vote yes on it and 12 countries to vote no on it. Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, Syria, Venezuela, Cuba. You know, I'm happy to have those countries vote no on this type of resolution.
Okay, we're looking for a question from the audience. Yeah. Sorry, Vicky, I'm making you run.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Cannon. I'm with the Department of the Air Force, and I have a question about definitions. So, Mr. DeSautel's, you said we can't define a space weapon. Is there an interest for the U.S. government to define a space weapon or the international community to do that?
There certainly is. The challenge we have right now is the one definition that is out there is in this draft Russia or China treaty. And it says that a weapon in space is an object that can damage, destroy, or disrupt the normal functioning of an object in space. And so the damage and destroy, you can kind of understand, but the disrupting, you could make an argument that an on-orbit servicer or an active debris removal payload would be able to disrupt something in space. And so really the challenge is figuring out how to not constrain all of these commercial entities, the dual use capabilities, because I think that is something that could clearly happen if we were to go down the path of the current draft. And so I think it's going to be easier potentially over time to define certain weapons. Like you might, have a type of weapon that everybody can agree, okay, that is a weapon. But then there's going to be things like robotic arms. Is a satellite with a robotic arm a weapon? Our UK colleagues launched a satellite called Remove Debris, and it had a harpoon on it. Is a harpoon a weapon or is it not a weapon? So I think there's going to be some areas where we may be able to reach agreement, but then other areas that it's just going to be difficult to figure that out. And so that's where maybe norms of behavior is going to be the appropriate, right? If you're an on-orbit servicer that the Russians or the Chinese are operating, I am never going to call you for on-orbit help. So please stay away. That would be irresponsible if you were to get too close to me.
Okay, that's another question. Way in the back.
Carl, Department of Defense Civilian. I understand the argument of wanting to change behavior, but I'm somewhat sympathetic to our Asian allies, for example, who believe demonstrating capability is a significant deterrent against other nations or spacefaring nations that have demonstrated capability as well. So I guess, how do we answer or assuage those concerns? And then how do we kind of defer potentially the counter argument that it's very easy for the United States to unilaterally declare a ban against this type of demonstration of capability, since we've already demonstrated it twice, and it's very easy for our other allies who have deep cultural defense ties, such as Canada and New Zealand, to hop on board. But if I'm a spacefaring nation in a AOR, the border is up against another nation that has demonstrated this capability, how do I, again, how am I supposed to sign on to this if I believe demonstrating this capability is fundamental to my deterrence strategy?
Yeah, I guess I would start by this is really a statement of restraint and leading by example and demonstrating leadership on the international stage. That said, it does not preclude us or any other nation to defend themselves. There are certainly things of, laws of armed conflict, laws of conflict. So it does not preclude us or any other nation to defend themselves and their assets when and if needed.
So, I don't know if this is then an answerable question, but discussion of these norms implies agreement upon some common principles and or common interpretations and definitions. We saw how difficult space weapons definition was. In the European Code of Conduct discussion, there was a provision in there that allowed for safety operations that did not create long-lived debris, specifically for things like burnt frost, which the Russians objected to because it was the use of force in space, and just on a principled basis, they objected to that regardless of the safety rationale. In the most recent open-ended working group, I've heard reports that the Russians objected to the application of international humanitarian law and law of armed conflict about distinction, proportionality, necessity, because that implies that the space environment is an area of conflict. Is there a way, or are there ways to bridge those kind of conceptual gaps, or do we just live with them or work around them or hope the Russians change? I mean, it's more of a mystery, I guess, but you know, when these kind of gaps come up in other kind of arms control situations, so not the first time, what do you do? What's a diplomatic strategy going forward to deal with really, really big conceptual gaps like that?
Right. We'll solve them, obviously. So I think there's multiple ways where you can meet with a foreign country to try to resolve these big policy concerns. Obviously, in 2015 was a very different environment, just as we talked about. You know, things have changed a lot, right? In 2015, we didn't have an Indian ASAT test. We didn't have 2021 a Russian ASAT test. So certainly this notion of them using force in space is now much clearer. They have done that. They have blown up one of their own satellites, although technically, from a legal perspective, you can't use force against yourself. So they didn't use force in space in that regard. But you could imagine a situation in the future when relations get better where we try to work these out either bilaterally or trilaterally or multilaterally to continue having that conversation. I think part of the point of the open-ended working group is to raise these issues so that they are identified, so that more than just the United States hear the Russians say things like that, so that non-aligned countries who believe that international humanitarian law might apply in space will start to question why would the Russians make such a claim, so that we can reach broad consensus. As I mentioned, we don't have to have perfect consensus. We just need a majority of countries to agree with us on this. And then once we can reach those agreements on some things, that gives us a piece of paper to continue having that conversation when we think behaviors are contrary to those commitments.
So we have like the major, not all the major, but certainly a large number of the major agencies here. So one of the questions online was like asking the panelists what they can or are doing, encouraging more collaboration across the different agencies, organizations going forward. That how do you see using this is the subject of our next panel, that how partnering with the private sector, partnering with NGOs. So this is more than just government top-down kind of thing going on, but what are the different mechanisms or events that you see for involving the private sector? What are the things you want Richard to do? What readings does Richard want to get invited to? Not want to get invited to. What are you thinking as an interagency for increasing collaboration and having everybody play to their strengths?
Maybe I'll chime in quickly. So Richard mentioned his visit out to the 18th Space Defense Squadron. The other part of that was a joint trip that Richard and I took together that DoD hosted Department of Commerce to get a baseline understanding of what DoD is doing when it comes to space flight safety, exploring what areas might be appropriate and right in the center of Department of Commerce's SPD3 mission. We left there and went to the Joint Commercial Office in Colorado Springs. So those are some of the activities that we're doing. Richard and I, we stay in close contact, since we've been in office, I guess probably just about every week we try to touch base via email or phone. And when it comes to the norms, one of the next steps is to collaborating with other allies and partners, and as well as NGOs to make public statements about the norm that they are interested in supporting. And I know Eric and the Department of State is getting into the next phase of getting others to make the same type of commitment.
There's a tremendous amount of interchange between our organizations as foot stomp everything Travis said. Same with the State Department. We're constantly calling each other. These are very complicated issues. I mean, we rely on NASA as playing a key role in helping us stand up a baseline technical system that we can compare commercial products to. And then from our perspective, we are looking not only internally to the government, but also we do expect that the commercial sector will play a very large role, if not the dominant role going forward as we stand up the SSA system. So that I would see that primarily being a commercially run operation. Obviously, the government will be in the background, both as rule setter and funder, and there's a lot of stuff that only we can do in terms of international collaboration, which is another component. So I see it as really a tight mesh of intergovernmental work, collaboration with the commercial sector, and growing international dialogue about SSA. And that latter piece is going to become increasingly important. And just a quick footnote, I mean, I know right now that we have these complications with Russia and China, and I don't want to minimize those in any way. But the truth is, if we're going to do a global SSA system, everyone has to participate. I mean, it's like an air traffic control system. If you said, oh yeah, well, we're not going to have, we're going to have an air traffic control system, but we're just not going to let the Canadians in. Well, it doesn't actually work. As long as the Canadians are flying airplanes, they have to be in the system. So I think we will need to figure out a way to, we have reached out many occasions to China. They have not chosen at this point to reciprocate in any meaningful way. I think that it's a problem we definitely need to fix going forward.
There has been some, maybe NASA comment, there has been some limited reciprocity on SSA, but beyond the Earth. So coordinating in and around Mars and coordinating in and around the moon, certainly exchanging basic information to assure that we don't run into each other, and also interference for comm traffic coming back. So it is possible, but we need to get closer to home. I would just add a kind of, we're coming up on time, kind of in another editorial comment with regard to the experiences from the long-term sustainability guideline development. There is continuous involvement by private industry and NGOs in that process. And in addition to, just having some smart input, one of the other benefits was the Congress, I think, continued to feel confident that it was going in a reasonable direction. That you can imagine the image of the UN making rules to control the future of space commerce, would not go over well in certain parts. And that the participation of industry and NGOs in that process all not only brought expertise in, but I think it also added to political stability and bipartisan support, so that when the long-term sustainability eventually things came out, the Congress was, oh, good job. We've been following that, and that's fine. And so sometimes making sure that nothing happens or that things go smoothly like that because you've had stakeholders involved from the beginning, I think was a wise strategy, and I see that continuing.
Yeah, if I could just comment on that. So we've been fortunate to have NGOs included in the open-ended working group. They are allowed to participate. They are doing many of the briefings. They have been allowed to submit papers as part of it and give remarks. The UN meetings are all online, so you can watch those. So week of September 12th, we start at 10 a.m. Geneva time. It's fascinating, thrilling. And so like Brian's organization, Secure World, has been invited to give remarks. A lot of other NGOs have been invited to give remarks. Now, the first two meetings so far have been focused on what are essentially state issues, right? What is the legal environment and what are the threats? And then going forward, as we talk about norms, we'll have to see about what sort of model is appropriate for a U.S. delegation.
Okay, very good. We'll take one question and then we'll break for lunch.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. Bradley, student at American University. And to close out this panel, I was hoping if you could maybe look at a more broad perspective on a space norm and policy procedure. Do you foresee it being like this ASAT declaration, a unilateral agreement that is slowly but surely worked to a multilateral and then hopefully a global recognition? Or do you see it more of working on a regional level, like let's say a NATO perspective, or more of a United Nations or more broad global organization level? Thank you.
I'm happy to take that one. To be diplomatic, it depends. I think the historical record shows that you can do both. So for example, the Incidents at Sea agreement that we have with now Russia and then the Soviet Union, it's a bilateral treaty. Many countries in Europe also have a bilateral Incidents at Sea agreement with Russia. But in Asia, they decided to go with a multilateral non-binding commitment. It's called the Code of Unplanned Encounters at Sea, or CUES. And so when you look at the language between the two, they're exactly the same. And so it's going to depend on what sort of norms we come up with. Some may be better as commitments that the United States makes. Some may be better as arms control treaties. Some may be better as bilateral agreements between the United States and a specific country. So we will just have to see as this norm process goes forward, what the decisions are as to how we approach different countries in different situations.
Okay, super. And with that, we'll break for lunch and we'll reconvene about 1:15.
That's for the meeting, Tom.
Okay, welcome everyone, and particularly our online friends. We're now taking up on panel 2 this afternoon, looking at the role of the private sector in norms. And control our mic and feedback. I will turn the panel over to Jamie Marin, my colleague from the Aerospace Corporation, who will be moderating the second panel.
Do you want to turn that mic off?
It is.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Welcome back. Everybody, please. Okay. We are delighted to continue the conversation here today with a standby, folks. Sorry.
Okay, try it again.
Should this computer, it's shown as not muted, should this be muted?
There you go.
All right, hopefully this works better. Apologies for the technical issue there. It is great to have everybody back for our second panel of this conversation. And if you're like me, you sat through the morning conversation furiously taking notes. I have about 14 observations, and obviously not all of which I can fit into this panel. So I'm really hoping that my fellow panelists toss up softballs that allow me to inject all of the various clever quips that I wrote down, or at least that felt clever to me when I wrote them down. But I won't try and use them all. I do want to start though by saying we heard in the opening remarks some conversation around the title of the event and the right way to talk about the moratorium that the vice president announced. And I do have a modest proposal surrounding that, which is if we're talking about a destructive direct ascent anti-satellite weapon moratorium, that we really should be talking about that's a DDAAM, right? So T. So that sounds like a D-damn-T to me. And since I worked in the Pentagon for several years, I know that you can make an acronym out of acronyms, which takes me to DDT, right? And if you know anything about the environmental movement, we were only able to save the eagles by banning DDT. Therefore, I rest my case. We are here talking about the specifics of the destructive direct ascent anti-satellite weapon moratorium, but we're not limited to that. We've explicitly brought in commercial providers for one really big reason here that emerges from the paper that Robin Dickey wrote and that Chirag was so generous in his comments about earlier today. We are in an environment of significantly democratized space. It is no longer enough for the governments to decide what to do. Governments have significant influence, but there are multiple drivers in this democratized space environment. It turns out in the field of international norms, that is not actually entirely new. One of the analogies Robin brought in her paper gets right at this. The first Geneva Convention, International Humanitarian Law of War, is driven by private citizens and what we would now call non-governmental organizations. One of the founders of what became the International Red Cross, with personal reaction, begins organizing a movement in the 19th century that culminates in a meeting of nations to agree to the first basic set of provisions for humanitarian conduct in times of war. He not only is coming up with the idea and co-founding the NGO, he's booking the hotel rooms for the national delegates that come to the convention in Geneva to negotiate what becomes the first Geneva Convention. I say this because we have some commercial folks on this panel and we have some commercial folks in the audience. I'm not asking you to book hotel rooms for our first panel, but the role of the commercial industry in providing important injects and thought leadership in the dialogue about what norms of operation are required for a safe, stable, sustainable space environment is real. And it's not one of passively sitting and waiting for the government to come up with the fora. It's one of proactively identifying opportunities. So that is one piece that I hope will come out of this panel. And I hope that to my colleagues here on the panel is a spur to aggressive and proactive thoughts as we have the conversation today. So we're going to offer first an opportunity for Robin Dickey to say a little bit about the paper, about which we've talked a little bit already today, and kind of give us a quick introduction to it. And then we'll offer our panelists a chance to reflect both on the paper and on this broader question of both the moratorium specifically and the next steps in norms. One concept that I'd like to offer to folks, just so we maybe don't talk past each other too much, is that we can think of norms of operation in space in terms borrowed from the proliferation and anti-proliferation movements. Let's think about horizontal expansion of norms as we cover different kinds of conduct or different kinds of capability. We can think about vertical expansion of norms, and we can think about deepening of norms as more and more players accede to them or start to adopt them. And maybe that language can help us as we think about, what's next. Is what's next, we're going to say more about direct ascent anti-satellite weapons and get more consensus around that, more adherence to that. That'd be one thing. Is it we're going to say more things about different aspects of the space environment? We're going to develop norms that drive towards sustainability or to stability in a competitive environment? Or is it we're really going to focus on getting dozens, scores, hundreds of adherents, whether it's to something like the Artemis Accords or the moratorium we're talking about here. Anyway, thoughts for language there. With that, let me pass. I'm seeing, I'm going to look to the GW folks. I'm hearing that Zoom is off. Which doesn't look like what it says here, but I'm seeing that in the comments section. If you guys can check that while I turn things over here to Robin, who's going to talk a little bit about the paper.
Can you hear me? Is this working? All right. So thank you everyone for coming here today. It's a real honor to be sitting amongst not only the panelists here, having gotten to listen to the panelists earlier this morning and Chirag, was not expecting at all to already get feedback on the paper, mainly because it is so long that I didn't expect anyone to have read it in the first 24 hours. It is actually so hot off the presses. We did not have copies ready this morning, but we were able to put copies out on the table during lunch. And if you look under your chairs, no, I did not put them under your chairs, but they are outside if you'd like a hard copy. To start with talking about the paper, and a lot of my motivation for writing it is to start with a broad look at how space norms are discussed in the community today and in recent years. So there is often a bifurcation in discussions on space norms between safety and sustainability issues on one hand and security issues on the other. It came up in the earlier panel how the latter are typically discussed in UN forums such as the First Committee, the Conference on Disarmament, whereas safety and sustainability are mainly talked about in the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. And this isn't to say that there's a perfect stovepiping between the two. There certainly is a lot of overlap, as we've all been saying. There's so much interconnectivity in space activities that you can't perfectly distinguish the two from each other. But what I was observing when I was starting my research on this project over a year ago was that commercial actors have done a lot. Many have participated significantly when it comes to safety and sustainability, both in just modeling and developing their own behaviors and in participating in discussions in the UN and otherwise. But when you look at security issues, once you put that label on a discussion, there tends to be more uncertainty, more confusion about what the commercial actors' role might be in those discussions, whether they should be in the discussions at all. And so I wanted to explore that in this paper through kind of three different questions. First of all, what are the security-related space challenges or threats that commercial actors might be concerned with, might be impacted by? Second of all, what are potential norms of responsible behavior in space that could help to mitigate those security challenges, and therefore that commercial actors might be interested in developing? And finally, how should commercial actors participate in the development? What are the different options for these different paths that have already been brought up of how norms can be formed? And there's a lot of different options for that. So focusing in on that first question, I looked at three different scenarios in which commercial actors could be threatened or could be attacked or could be impacted by security-related activities. And those are becoming collateral damage from the security-related actors and different behaviors that weren't necessarily intended to harm commercial actors, but through their proximity or their indiscriminate nature of different systems being used, that commercial could be in harm's way. And this is really where the kinetic or destructive anti-satellite missile testing and the particular vice president's announcement from earlier this year really comes into play, because the testing of a weapon against a satellite that destroys it and creates debris obviously is not controlled in a way that you can ensure that commercial satellites are not going to be impacted either by the debris directly or by having to maneuver out of the way. And for each scenario, I bring an analogy. And in this case, the analogy is landmines. Anti-personnel landmines have a lot of similarities to challenges like space debris because once they're in place, they can cause an area to become roughly unusable for decades afterwards. It's much more difficult to remove a landmine than it is to create a landmine or put it in place. And there's a lot of challenges with situational awareness, mapping, and tracking when you have an area in which you know there are landmines, but you actually don't know where they are specifically. And so this is to exemplify that when I worked through the paper, because there aren't a lot of clearly established trends, major incidents or examples that can easily be pointed to for what's going to happen in space in the future on security issues, you have to kind of cobble together a puzzle of a bunch of different elements. And so these cross-domain examples was one of those options. I also look at current signals and challenges. The Starlink constellation having to maneuver out of the way of pieces of debris from the Russian ASAT test is another example of that. And so through that, you can kind of build a vision of, in the future, commercial actors may have to think about how behaviors that are to this point solely conducted by states in terms of kinetic ASAT testing could directly impact their operations and impose a number of costs. And so that's the one that I will focus on for today, since that's our larger discussion. The other two scenarios that were brought up is the issues of misidentification or misinterpretation of different behaviors and how that can escalate out of control. You know, a commercial actor doesn't have to be immediately identified as a threat or a concern or something, or a potential target by a state actor, but it can still become in harm's way. And this is examples of the shoot downs of commercial aircraft that we've seen over the last 70 years. There's been, I counted, at least 11 cases of states shooting down commercial aircraft because they were off course. They accidentally navigated into sensitive territory or airspace. There were communication failures in which the pilots did not hear or did not see the signals from intercepting aircraft. And so the intercepting aircraft thought that that meant that they were being ignored and it was a potential hostile behavior. And so all of these escalations out of control are similar examples to, in space, the potential issues we've already seen with the Russian satellite in 2015 sidling up next to the Intelsat commercial satellites, and there being a lot of challenges of who are we supposed to communicate to if someone's getting too close? How do we, deconflict this situation? And then finally, the third scenario was looking at the challenges of if commercial actors become a direct target. We've already talked a lot today about the law of armed conflict and the protections that there are for civil and commercial actors in different situations, but there's also been a lot of debate on how exactly that gets applied in space, especially when you have commercial actors that could be providing services to militaries. But in my example, there are plenty of historical cases of commercial actors that were not doing anything related to a conflict, to supporting a military, that still came under fire. And so how do norms help to prevent all of this? And Chirag mentioned that I have my own definition. It was pretty similar to what he mentioned, but it's the idea that norms are general agreement on what kinds of behavior are acceptable and unacceptable. And I distinguish these from other mechanisms and tools of international relations because they all can be interrelated with each other. You can use legally binding documents to help create a norm because this is one way to establish commitment. You can also have non-binding agreements. You can have bilateral decisions that aggregate, or you can just have individual countries saying that's not acceptable, that is acceptable. And so when we think about all of these situations in which commercial actors might be concerned about security issues, you have a lot of potential norms like how are we establishing lines of communication when there's concerns from a commercial actor by a state's behavior or vice versa to make sure they're actually able to contact each other? Do we have common understandings of what behavior is considered threatening or non-threatening? And do we have common understandings of where we are, what we're doing, what the threshold is for example, too close? How are different countries or actors defining conjunctions? All of these are norms in which commercial actors could have a stake in a security context, not just a safety and sustainability context. And so hopefully we'll be able to talk more on the different paths through which commercial actors might get involved. But I know that some of my colleagues on the panel might also have some contributions on that as well through the work that they've been doing. But basically you can participate in norm development through national engagement directly with countries, either through partnerships with specific agencies, responses to requests for information, even old-fashioned lobbying. Those are all ways of interacting on a national level to contribute to international formation of norms. There are also, as was mentioned earlier, ways to participate in international fora, either as observer members. The ITU is a very interesting example of commercial actors participating directly in working groups, agenda formation, etc. And then there's also the options for commercial actors in consortia, in associations, or even just through public advocacy, responding to norms that they're seeing as they're developing and supporting or suggesting or interacting with that norm development in some way so that it gets the broader reach. And that is something that we've begun to see with the announcement on the refraining from destructive anti-satellite missile tests. And that is a couple commercial actors, including some represented by folks on this panel, have commented on both the original Russian ASAT test in 2021 and the announcement in April to say, we support the idea of this norm developing. Commercial actors didn't have to write the text themselves, but it makes a big difference in that the broad proliferation of a norm if you're getting active engagement by everyone who's impacted. So with that, I think I'll leave it to the rest of the panel.
Well, thank you very much, Robin, and I hope maybe some of your fellow panelists will have a chance to react to those thoughts as well as offer their own. Let me start with Dan here, and the full bios, of course, are in the program materials, but Dan's a really important contributor to the space situational awareness community, I guess we'd call it now. He's after starting his career with a fine organization known as Aerospace, he was I think an early or first plank holder with AGI.
In the Space Data Association work, yes.
In the SDA work, and then now ComSpock, and has just done an enormous amount of work, technical and theoretical, kind of across this field. So Dan,
I have 2 slides.
if you prefer, yeah, jump right up.
Yeah.
Oh, I think actually, are they on the,
I can
they're on
run
your
them.
computer?
Are they on the
for that
desktop?
reason.
How do we get to the slides? I'm not Apple.
All right.
Smart. I
Our
used to
colleagues
be.
from George Washington will take care of us.
Yeah, so my thanks to the Elliott School of International Affairs team for inviting me to be on this panel. I think this is a critical topic. And so as Chirag noted this morning, I think it's important for us to get a baseline of where we're at. And I'm using kind of the Russian ASAT test as a proxy for where we're at. And you can see that fold into things, but it's not just ASATs here. This particular video you're seeing is showing the effect of not just discrete fragments, but where fragments could go. So the concept mentioned this morning about being able to grab these before they spread, this video shows you how fast they actually spread. They go around the full orbital belt in a rev and a half. So that's an issue. Now, ComSpock has long operated its Space Data Center for the Space Data Association. And this video should be moving on to the next slide. Or next, yeah, there we go. Oh, can you go back? Yeah. Sorry, this is all timed and automated, and but that's fine. So ComSpock has been, let's see, why don't I just grab that controls? Sorry about that. So ComSpock has long been operating the commercially operated Space Data Center, the Space Data Association, providing safety of flight for nearly 30 operators and 700 spacecraft in all orbital regimes. Last December, not long after the DoD first released public information on the ASAT causing debris, our SDC analysts discovered the existence of what we call conjunction squalls. And that is a dramatic localized increase by an order of magnitude or more in the number of conjunctions. And that spans a week or 2 at most. Technical details of this are presented in April at the IAA SSA conference and freely available on our ComSpock website. But we used our predictive volumetric tool to assess and predict conjunctions. So the middle upper graph there shows our predictions in black, and then in the blue dots are actually data from our operational system. And you can see that this analytic tool matched very well to what actually happened. And then a couple weeks ago, we announced that there was another conjunction squall that Starlink was facing. So at the bottom left, you can see all of what this impact over time has been from these events. And you can see that ASAT events have been a prime contributor to our space debris population, with the Chinese ASAT, the unfortunate Iridium Cosmos collision, unintentional, and then the Russian ASAT. And now we can even see in the fabric of the 2021 spatial density, we can see the large constellations building up there. So let's set aside the ASAT stuff and just look at where we're at now. The bottom middle chart shows you how the LEO conjunction rates have increased in just the last 5 years by a factor of 5. It's really spiked. And that's driven by these ASAT events. It's driven by new large constellations and so forth. But the bottom line is, in the bottom right, there is the topology as a function of altitude and inclination of how frequently you're going to come close to something else, how likely it is you're going to run into something else. And you can see by the bottom right plot, it's very spiky. There are places where if you're going to put a satellite there, a constellation there, you might want to think again, because you are putting yourself at risk by doing so. And getting back to this morning's discussion, I think maybe Eric was positing that we should look at costs, resources, expense. Costs are going to go up if you have to use your maneuvering fuel. And Tom mentioned that as well. So if you go in those orbits, you're going to have to spend a lot of resources avoiding. How do we as a space community address these challenges? Previously, I've characterized the space governance in terms of a topology. And if you look at the X and Y axes on here, X axis goes from non-mandatory to mandatory. Y axis goes from top level detail up to very detailed. And I had put a whole bunch of companies' logos on this topology, but I'm shifted more to a jigsaw puzzle sort of analogy, where you look at the education piece at the bottom left. This is analogous to what both NGOs like Secure World Foundation and commercial satellite imagery SSA systems and operators do to help educate the community on the need for norms of behavior. If you think about the commercial imagery satellites and how they help transparently get the pulse of activities in Ukraine and other areas, commercial satellites and SSA companies have the ability to transparently monitor the space environment, identify and monitor operational risks, etc. And consider that most of the publicly posted assessments of the harmful effects of the Russian ASAT test were conducted by industry, providing a valuable path to share such information outside the security framework. And second, an area where I personally see tremendous contribution from industry is assembly of commercial best practices and aspirational norms. Notable norms and standards developed are happening in industry coalitions such as the Space Safety Coalition, Space Data Association, CSF, SIA, AIA, Confers, and others. The SSC, Space Safety Coalition, is currently working on updating its best practices, and those are freely published at spacesafety.org. Now, as opposed to the horizontal expansion that Jamie mentioned earlier, where just like with the Russian ASAT test, we unilaterally say we're going to do something that we think is a good behavior, and we'd like others to model it. And you hope to grow it out horizontally to other organizations. Something that's aligned well with the commercial industry is vertical expansion of norms. And that's something I've witnessed firsthand because just as in the Space Safety Coalition and other industry documents, we've seen commercial best practices inform and seed the creation of national regulations, international standards, and even treaties and guidelines. A third area that the industry contributes to is in codifying best practices as international standards, which is shown in the upper middle there, developed within the International Organization for Standardization, or ISO, and the Consultative Committee for Space Data Systems, or CCSDS. Standards currently led by commercial industry within those bodies include the most heavily used data sharing and operation standards that support space sustainability and space traffic management, to include standards for space traffic coordination, large constellations, conjunction data messages, orbit data messages, and all of which we anticipate will be published fairly soon. It's critical that these important standards get widespread adoption, not just in the commercial operator community, but also in the US government, I would say, and reflect not only the best practices being used, but that the requirements of the standards are achievable, verifiable, and have market relevance. Commercial inputs on international proposals to create rules of the road or give way concepts are also extremely important. We find that the international community seems to be more focused on developing rules of the road perhaps than domestically, but there's interest, I think, across the board. But we need those to be, if they are standardized or regulated, they need to be operationally realistic. As clearly spelled out in the 2020 US Standards Strategy document, the US is a bit different from other countries in that the US emphasizes the use of open, transparent, voluntary consensus standards as much as possible in regulations and procurement, in lieu of creating additional regulatory requirements. While there are many benefits to this approach, a downside has been, in my opinion, that some foreign governments have had a far greater direct participation in the creation of these standards than ours, because their regulatory frameworks, in some cases, adopt and incorporate by reference these international standards that are being developed. I do have to, comment on a comment that was made this morning about if standards are going to be built and you want a standard, you have to show up to help build it. The fact is, in my opinion, in the international community, commercial has shown up. We've been working not in the space security side that Robin mentioned, but in the space safety and sustainability side for many years. So we have shown up. I am very encouraged that I see more and more US government participation in these international standards development activities. So I think that's great. And I do appreciate the thought piece that Robin contributed along with her collaborators into how the commercial industry can help participate in development of space security standards. But again, just to hammer it home, commercial has been and long and will continue to be participants in the development of best practices and standards for space safety. For these final three pieces of the jigsaw puzzle, commercial industry also works to help inform the creation of regulations through notices of proposed rulemaking and the FCC's very nice process of iteration and information. And we look forward to continuing that as well. So that's my prepared remarks. I thank you for your attention. And I hope the overview of how commercial helps stir up, commercial involvement helps stir up some great questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Before we pass it on to the next panelist, I want to press you on one additional point
Sure.
and just ask, you've laid out a very nice framework for thinking about the areas of collaboration here. What do you think are the specific technical or procedural areas of highest potential? Where would you most like to see things expand into more formalization?
I work a lot in there's two types of standards. There's data and how you convey data and the formats and the terminology behind all of that. We've been working very hard within CCSDS to come up with this orbit data message and more importantly, the terminology behind it, the definitions, reference frames, element sets, and so forth. And that I would love to see, again, vertically adopted and embraced by everybody. What people oftentimes don't realize is can be a 15-year lag before data messages are adopted. Why is that? It's because satellites, a lot of times their mission lasts 15 years. And when they're first built, they get their mission system and it's designed with certain messages and data formats in mind. So the sooner we get data messages standardized and out into industry, the better off we'll be. There's the other class of standards is behavior. How should you operate? How should you design? How should you test? How should you manage? How should you handle your materials and debris mitigation? All that stuff, there are standards out there, but those are pay for standards. So I think one of the things the US government struggles with, and rightly so, is how do we get standards that are available to all and like universities, CubeSats and so forth, community, where they're affordable and accessible. Technically, how do we get to the behavior of post-mission disposal of 0.9? It should be 0.95 or 0.99, you name it, but we're not even close to that. So how do we get operators incentivized, interested in getting that higher?
Yeah, thank you very much, Dan. That's two points definitely that have come up over the years, and one being that for the sustainability of the environment, people's actual compliance with what they say they're going to do is perhaps even more important than how ambitious it is of what they say they will do. And then that particularly as the environment gets more crowded, the operators generally, as with the Space Data Association model, the operators have better intelligence as to where their vehicle is than anyone else. And robust sharing of that information in formats that everyone can understand dramatically reduces the amount of perceived conjunctions as you get the covariances down.
Yep.
So Dan, appreciate it. And as always, provocative and insightful. Let me turn next to Joe Anderson. And Joe is with Space Logistics, which emerged out of Orbital ATK and Northrop Grumman after they acquired it, and has been working on issues related to satellite servicing for a couple decades now, really?
I've been working on it for a little over 10 years. Yeah, 12 years.
Yeah, we're lucky to have your thoughts here. And, just as Dan is dealing with the reality of pulling together all of this data and insight into where people are, you're pressing up against the existing understanding of what are people allowed to do and how are they going to go about new missions. So
Yeah,
very
definitely.
interested in your thoughts.
Definitely. Well, first I want to thank you, Jamie, and Scott, and all the others that collaborated to pull this symposium together. It's a great activity for us all to be involved in. And I think, to the higher level purpose of this symposium, for space logistics, and I think, probably for the whole commercial industry, we certainly support the U.S. position on the ASAT testing. I think it almost goes without saying that is the case. And it's really an important step to ensuring space sustainability. And I think it also is a great demonstration of, establishing new norms of behavior in space. And as you mentioned, so Space Logistics, that name, this company actually was formed in about 2015, 2016 timeframe when we first were fully funded to produce our first mission extension vehicle. And this is really all about space sustainability. Our business is about sustaining space. And today we have 2 mission extension vehicles that are in orbit, in geosynchronous orbit, providing life extension to geocommunication satellites. To date, we've provided almost 4 years of combined life extension to those satellites. And I think We and our commercial industry partners through confers are likewise, establishing good examples of norms of behavior to further support the sustainability of space. Our MEVs have performed the first ever rendezvous proximity operations and docking in geosynchronous orbit. Never been done before. It's also the first time between two commercial satellites. So we're breaking a lot of ground here. There's no regulations set up, no licensing regimes that were set up before we did this. We worked closely together with the State Department and the FCC and NOAA to find a way to get through our national licensing process, and we were successful at that. I would like to go, I think this is a community, maybe not everyone has seen these videos before. I've shown them in a lot of other probably more technical and customer type events, but if we go to the next slide and click on that link that's there, we've got a great video that demonstrates, and this is real footage of a rendezvous and docking in geosynchronous orbit, and that's not pulling up the right thing. It worked earlier. Maybe close that and try clicking there again. Are you in presentation mode? Oh, it's playing on here. It's not playing up there. That's interesting. What happened there? Is there a way to project from this one? Because this seems to be playing. You could come help.
Yeah, please help.
Help over here and how we put that on the Zoom. So the video that you're eventually going to see here when we get the IT support working on that is the rendezvous and docking of our second mission extension vehicle. This vehicle is docking to the Intelsat 1002 satellite in geosynchronous orbit. These images are coming from our mission extension vehicle. You'll see sort of two different sets of images. The first will be infrared cameras, and then we'll transition into visible cameras. The whole video spans about a 12-hour time frame of the final rendezvous and approach to the Intelsat 1002 satellite. Looks like we're almost there.
Have an Apple PC expected norm of behavior that's just not quite agreeing.
It's funny because it worked this morning when we tried. All right, still not working.
It's aspirational.
It's aspirational. All right, well, we'll let her keep trying to. Oh, there we go. Now we got it working. You can drag that back to the beginning of the video. Right, so this covers about 12 hours as we're rendezvousing to the Intelsat 1002 satellite here. And coming here, we're starting to come around to the backside of the client. Now, these mission extension vehicles, we dock to two features that are present on about 80% of all of the satellites in GEO. That's a liquid apogee engine and the launch adapter ring. And that's how we clamp the two vehicles together. Once our MEV is docked, the MEV takes over both the orbit and attitude control of the combined stack. And then we stay docked for the duration of the life extension. So Intelsat has signed up for 2 5-year life extensions using these two mission extension vehicles. At the end of those, we'll undock and we'll go to the next customer. So it's a multiple use type of application. Now, all right, now maybe we could go back to the PowerPoint and forget the video. It's a really cool video. There's a bunch of them online, so you can go take a look at those at your leisure. Those of us who are really into space kind of geek out on that because they're real images. They are not, done on the ground with graphics. So there's a lot that goes behind this in terms of setting norms of behavior. And for example, on the first mission extension vehicle, the first docking we did in geosynchronous orbit, we intentionally worked with Intelsat and agreed mutually that we should do this first rendezvous and docking out in the graveyard orbit, which is about 300 kilometers above GEO. That we're hoping is setting a norm of behavior that if you're going to do this type of new activity in a populated orbit like geosynchronous orbit, do it somewhere safe. And so we took that opportunity on our own. We were not forced to do this by any of our regulators, but setting what we hope is a norm of behavior. And that norm of behavior is something that's now been adopted by CONFERS. So CONFERS has added that to their basic operating principles for all members of that organization. And it's been pushed out actually as far as now an ISO standard through our practices and best practices. And what was the other document we have there, Charity? Principles. Thank you, Brian. Our principles and practices documents that eventually became an ISO standard document illustrates one example of a good norm of behavior. And that applies to our future roadmap. So this is showing space logistics future roadmap, but to show that, this first rendezvous and docking, that's just the start of where commercial industry is going with new types of capabilities that previously haven't been licensed, haven't been thought about, norms, behaviors haven't been started. MEV was our first. Our second generation is a robotic vehicle that's going to be able to repair satellites in orbit, augment them, add new capabilities to satellites, relocate satellites, perhaps recycle satellites, starting the initial capabilities of doing that. So that's starting in 2024, that will be launching. So again, a whole new regime of types of norms and behaviors. So what do you do if you have robotics in orbit? Looking forward past that, in-orbit assembly, refueling. Now we start getting the satellites that are prepared to be serviced, satellites that have refueling mechanisms on them so they can be refueled. Well, now we got to start thinking about fuel depots and what are standards and norms and behaviors for how those should operate. And then looking further into the future, it's about in-orbit assembly and manufacturing. So there's a lot of new capabilities coming online that commercial industry is bringing. I think we're demonstrating through the activities with CONFERS that commercial industry can do this in a safe, reasonable way and work together to help establish new norms of behavior. So I think that pretty well covers my initial comments.
All right, thank you very much, Joe. And I'm going to ask you some questions down the road about, in particular, what kinds of behaviors you would find concerning. You talked about your work to set a good standard for demonstrations of docking capability outside of the actively employed orbit slots. What kind of behaviors would you think are most concerning and we ought to clearly rule out? And I think you've got a unique perspective on that. Before we get to that, though, I do want to turn to our final panelist, Charity Whedon, who leads the policy activity at Astroscale. And so another company working to field services that hitherto had not been available commercially or otherwise. Charity is well known as part of the first family of space policy, or as I like to refer to her, the smart Whedon. Not to be confused with the other Whedon who, well, no, she's the nice Whedon too. No, we're very lucky to have you on the panel, Charity, and to have your better half or other half, at least, in the audience. So if you could talk a little bit about how Astroscale's thinking about these issues and where you see the community going.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you, Jamie. First, I want to congratulate Robin on the amazing report that she's done and actually coining a new term in this era of normentum. I think that's fantastic and definitely a legacy here. So modern society, of course, needs a predictable, stable, and safe environment. And that we're not just talking about us here on the panel or you out there, but actually the public needs a safe and sustainable and predictable space environment. And that's our vision at Astroscale, the safe and sustainable development of space for the benefit of future generations. And that vision statement is mainly why I'm here today and pleased to be on the panel and talk about norms of behavior, not just in security, but in sustainability as well. So Astroscale does this through life extension services, active debris removal, end of life services. That's when satellites are actually prepared to be docked with in a consensual manner, and an ability to remove their satellite safely out of orbit, and also in situ space situational awareness as part of our mission set. Astroscale will speak up when we see irresponsible behavior. I think this alone, saying something, being part of the dialogue, is a positive development, as private operators have a lot at stake. After all, space is a domain of commerce, not just warfighting. So you may have read in the CSPS paper that Astroscale has provided statements on the Russian ASAT test of 2021. We did the same for the Indian ASAT test in 2019 as well. We believe that the intentional and unnecessary destruction of any object in space is irresponsible. Full stop. And this brings us to the point here of having certainty in orbit. Whenever there are activities, irresponsible activities in orbit, that brings uncertainty to operators, to investors, to insurers. The point here is to provide a certain space environment so we can grow our space economy, conduct operations peacefully, and see it thrive, see everyone thrive in orbit. We also made a statement when the Vice President announced the direct-ascent ASAT moratorium. This US statement and others that have spoken up, the commitment is a good promotion of norms of responsible behavior. It's also good governance, and it supports the advancement of security and stability in space. So there are a couple things within the paper I wanted to highlight and foot stomp. The first one is about threats, of the misidentification of private activities during a conflict. Now, I really feel this is a specific threat where private operators can most mitigate. Transparency, through transparency and encouraging a more certain regulatory pathway that provides effective oversight and continuous supervision of novel commercial space activities. Also important is developing industry best practices, standards, our own norms, if you will, is equally as important. And as you've heard several times already, Confers is a prime example of over 50 industry members from around the globe who are coming together to form standards and best practices for rendezvous and proximity operations. So I feel the last time I was here, I had an analogy to parenting. And I have another one here today for you. Every 3 years, I have an analogy that comes up. I ask my kids where they are on this ladder. Did you show up? Did you do the work? Did you do the work well? And are you going to knock it out of the park? Are you going to change the world? I feel the same is happening in the norms development here, and we can use this as an analogy. Are you showing up to the debate and the discussion? Are you doing the work domestically to get the United States understanding and one solid voice here? Are you doing it with partners and allies to build momentum in this norm? And then are you changing the world with these norms? Is there a norm? So industry can definitely support this. Norms both domestically and multilaterally. Number one, we are the largest sector active in space today. We often cross borders. Multinational companies can touch other nations around the world, maybe more easily than one nation can. We hold a diverse set of voices in the discussion. It's certainly important to have a government voice and an NGO voice, but the commercial voice will help bring diversity as well. And then there are those in the industry, like here today, like those involved with Confers, those that have signed up to the Space Safety Coalition. Those are actors, those are private actors going above and beyond. And I feel their voice definitely should be part of the dialogue as well. What do I see as coming next? I have some ideas as we get into the dialogue, but definitely a good step forward on space security of this new norm of direct-ascent ASAT moratorium. I'd like to see companion efforts in COPIUS on the space sustainability and safety side, where LTS 2.0 is starting to be formed and the agenda set there. What can we do? Can we leapfrog one against the other and build that together. So I will pause there and just, a last, word of the Boy Scout motto of leave no trace, or leave the environment better than that which you found it. I think that's a good motto to go for us here as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Charity. And we had one audience member in the virtual audience, Ravi Sharma, who had a question to Joe, which I think actually is really to both of you. And he in a sense has answered his own question here. So I'll just read it for the group. He was asking to the space logistics, have you developed deorbiting services for crowded LEO space? And of course, that's where our final panelist really is. And Ravi has coined the term of another LES. So you have life extension services, and Astroscale has life ending services.
I wouldn't put it that way.
So if you're gonna, if you use that, please credit Ravi Sharma and this event. We have a number of questions from the online audience. I'll get one or two of them in, and then I'll have a few from myself and then the audience in person here as well. An overarching one from Andrew Woodcock, which I thought was quite helpful in terms of a next step. And I think there's actually multiple answers to this question, but I'd appreciate the panelists' perspective on who would make an effective convener of commercial operator expertise to discuss and develop proposed operational norms domestically and internationally. You've mentioned confers already, Charity, and we've got Brian here to provide further expertise on that as required. But to the rest of the panel, what do you think about appropriate conveners? All of you have been part of these kinds of conversations in one way, shape, or form.
Yeah, the problem is, I think, I listed off in my talk some 8 different industry associations, and some of them, like confers, focus on on-orbit servicing, RPO. Others are more policy oriented. Some are looking at launch. So I don't know what the answer is. How do you get the industry, which has all these little components and pools, to be that mouthpiece? I think everybody, Space Safety Coalition included, should be part of the dialogue to help build that. But there will be difficulty having one single mouthpiece, I think, because of all the disciplines involved.
I also feel you're not going to get a homogeneous discussion from all of industry. There are a lot of different stakeholding components that go into coming up with a single statement. It's very, very difficult, and it does get watered down the more folks that are involved. So sometimes you have to select specifically people, experts. Sometimes they're from NGOs that would represent an independent voice, but also kind of outside government. But then again, I would also, recommend going to those industry groups that are actually making a difference, going above and beyond, have documents to support a position as well.
Yeah, I support what's been said on both sides here. And I would just add or foot stomp maybe that it's a broad spectrum of technologies and needs. And so saying there's one, I think is very challenging. Take confers, for example, right? We're very focused on rendezvous, proximity operations, and servicing activity. Right? When we go beyond that, we reference other standards, other bodies that are involved in that. So we're not trying to recreate those within confers. So I do think it's a distributed architecture that's needed to do that.
Robin, anything you wanted to add?
I think largely echoing what everyone has said, and to borrow a word from Eric Destels at the beginning, it depends. It is truly based off of, I think there's the 2 different sets of bifurcation are the policy level discussions and the technical operational level discussions. Both are very important in norm development, for some norms more than others. But there's some advantages to having operators sit around the table especially since there tends to be a common frame of reference or at least similar experiences that then can be translated, which can help to build up that initial understanding, perhaps which is then translated to the broader policy level discussions and can help set some agreements at a low level that might have really caused a traffic jam in the discussions at the higher level. But also echoing the point of, with norms, you don't have to solve all of your norm problems through one convener, through one approach. You can look at different issues, both in terms of topic, in terms of the degree of commitment that you need to ensure it's going to be successful. You can split those into lots of different forums. And we see today that there are so many different ways to develop norms, both in terms of topics and in terms of the mechanisms used in the discussion.
Dan, did you want to jump in with another?
Yeah, at the risk of bringing in a action hero reference, the movie Thor, where that little beam of light shoots into space. To me, that's kind of what we did with Confers. We're a part of that too. For that specific discipline, standards were built or proposed, and they were shot up to an ISO level, to an international level, to address that specific discipline. And I think that's probably the most realistic way we'll have to get the commercial interest vectored up in specific areas where it really contributes.
Thank you for that. I was a little concerned when you first brought in that reference that you were going to propose a magic hammer
No,
thrown into space. to
more
remove-
debris.
Yeah, which would, I think, would violate a direct ascent, destructive, anti-satellite. Yeah, demonstration tests would be problematic.
Not do that.
Yeah. All right. Well, I want to ask you guys to talk, and I presaged this a little bit. I'd like you to talk about your fears. We've kind of talked a lot about opportunity and ways to extend norms, ways to broaden horizontally, vertically, or deepen. What is the behavior or capability that's most concerning to you individually or to your organizations, where you think we need to get ahead of the problem proactively and develop an approach that builds to a norm?
I'll start. There's several. We have shown in our conjunction analyses that how frequently things come together. And like I showed, factor of 5 increase in the last 5 years. We really have to get on top of this. And that means we need more accurate data to feed the assessments so that we know when something is coming close and when it isn't better. But it also means that we need to have a way to cut through all the encounters that we have, coordinate with others to address them. The fears I have as well there is that we, again, time is not our friend here. We have standards, we have some processes for sharing data, but new space and those rates are climbing so fast. It feels like we do a lot of talking. With COVID, there's been these telecon bingo cards where you can look for a word to check off. And sometimes we go to these sorts of conferences and we hear tragedy of the commons, negative externalities, so forth, and you can check them off again and again and again. But it's really the progress that I'm just concerned we need to make more of sooner.
As a former economist, I'm a little concerned about your examples there, but I'll let them skate.
So clearly the debris issue is huge, and I won't repeat that. I'll bring up another area, and when we look at the the principles that Confers has put out, there's really 3 key things there it's around being responsible, cooperative, and transparent. That's really what our principles are about for rendezvous proximity operations, right? That's really important. Not just for our immediate customers, but for the neighbors, or for our adversaries, perhaps that, it's much more difficult to communicate with, that they know and understand what we're doing, that we're transparent, that we're not a threat. That's a real challenge. And in our missions, we had some challenges with that. We had some adversaries that were nearby and they were not being communicative with us. We're trying to reach out to them. We reached through state, we reached through, the Air Force. We tried every channel we could to make sure that they knew that we were approaching this other satellite here peacefully, and, please just recognize that we're not threatening you, but no answer, right? So, to me, that's a problem. I think Intelsat has experienced that as well. You've heard others on record, right, where they've come and parked right next to them and there's no communication. Is this a threat or isn't it a threat? That's a real challenge.
Thank you.
So I completely agree. ASAT tests, they're the most violent and very sudden, right? It does shock the public. It shocks operators in space. There's a bit of chaos. So where's this going? We rely on Dan and his team and others out there to help navigate through the squall. But the other things that I guess keep me up at night are just the day-to-day breakups. Oh, upper stage just broke up. Oh, right? Like, and it's almost like we start to get used to it. Oh, there's only been 3 breakups this year, but how many pieces of debris, how much risk has that added to the space environment? Going off Tom's great remarks earlier on what is the cost added to operators. So just the added chaos and debris generated from breakups that were not deliberate is another item. And of course, anything that's going to impact humans in space, I feel that is just, gosh, none of us want that to happen. And we need to think ahead and make sure that doesn't happen as well. And then just finally is adding that slow but surely methodical difficulty to operations, the costs, the engineering, the complexity of it all, a lengthier process to get a license because you're going into a risky orbit. Just all of this together brings, again, back to the word uncertainty for operators.
Yeah, thank you, Charity. It seems like you're not to belabor the tragedy of the commons point, but you're coming back to a classic issue. We are, as a society, individual nations, even the global level, we're very good at responding to the immediate trauma of a acute disaster. Flash flood, okay, we know how to fix it after the fact. Global warming, insidious, century scale, much more problematic to organize around, as we've witnessed over the last 20 years, and obviously parallels here. That's helpful. Let me shift gears to more of the security side. We have a number of questions in the chat, and I think an overarching question probably with folks in the room as well. We have a lot of interesting industry engagement, self-organized, and also in the context of intergovernmental organizations around safety and sustainability. How should, in this democratized environment where industry is playing at a scale that is dramatically different than historical, and in an environment where, if we're going to be blunt, I think we are closer to major power conflict than we have been in a pretty long period of time, right? NATO is not at war with Russia, but we have Russia invade a sovereign nation on its border, and the West is actively supporting resistance there. Challenges in the Pacific as well, of course. What can industry do in the realm of space security? And if we are in an environment for perhaps decades to come of enhanced international security tension and potentially conflicts, how should industry be thinking about norms surrounding dual use capabilities that, the issues that Robin brings up in detail in her paper? Thoughts from the panel there?
Well, if I can get started from a bit of the perspective brought up in the paper, of course, I run through a laundry list of challenges and opportunities at that
You
intersection.
did have 24 pages. Not 23, not 23. I went and confirmed. Chirag again was wrong.
And I did not know the answer at all when he said that. So I was nodding and then I was shaking my head and then nodding again. I didn't know. But when it comes to the challenges of trying to diffuse tensions, or when there are possible, intersections, threats, engagements in space that could involve commercial actors, there's similar layers of challenges for that there are with norm discussions in general. A series of hurdles that you could get stuck on in the conversation. First of all, do you agree on the concept that you're discussing? If one country says, you are too close to me, this is going to cause a conjunction, and another actor, another country says, no, you're not too close. I'm looking at this and I'm fine with this. I'm comfortable. That's one thing that could lead to escalation. The second level is, do you actually speak the same language, both figuratively and literally? There are many languages that use one word to describe the terms safety and security. One word for both concepts, and that can lead to lots of confusion depending on how you're being translated. But also the challenges discussed earlier of there's no common definition for space weapon. A lot of other space terms don't have that common agreement. So if you don't even know what words you're using, and if they mean the same thing to both people, that's where things can go off the rails. And the third layer of the issues, which was mentioned by Joe, is, did you actually manage to get on the phone with each other? Are you having a conversation? That was a problem that was brought up in the UN in this past year, when China submitted a report saying that the Starlink satellites, several of them had done close approaches to their new space station that they've been putting pieces up on orbit. And well, first of all, there was the problem of China and the US disagreed on what was considered too close. But also China said, we tried to contact you and you didn't answer. And the US and SpaceX were like, well, we tried to contact you and you didn't answer. And so norms can help fix those problems, but they're also obstacles. And any one of those, if you are in a heightened state of geopolitical tensions, could be the start of a pathway that really goes off the rails. So being able to think of those hurdles and resolve them when you're in the norm development phase will hopefully help diffuse those tensions more easily when you're in a crisis or you're in an engagement on orbit.
Thank you, Robin. Others?
Let me see, commercial capabilities have some innate things to them, I think, that help actually mitigate some security things, including transparency. If we look at the conjunction of Starlink and the Chinese station that Robin just mentioned, we commercially could look at that. We could assess the conjunction rates of Starlink against that station and see that they were a tiny percentage of the overall risk to that same station. And commercially, we can publish blogs and papers that share that, and we did. Also, just the fact that Starlink has many satellites, or other, or OneWeb have diverse and dispersed communication nodes is a huge help to security as well, potentially. But that said, there are still the sort of issues that Robin's paper brings up of cybersecurity and other elements that maybe commercially haven't had to be addressed in the past that now probably do. And so there's still a real concern, I think, that we move in that direction.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah, so I think my thought, going back to your question about, the dual use nature and how do we cope with that? From my perspective, thinking of, all right, if you're a commercial service, but that capability could be thought of as, having other uses. Following the principles that we've laid out, I'll speak from, again, from CONFERS, the responsible, transparent, cooperative nature. Following those principles very closely, I think, is what you need to do to make sure that you're on that commercial side, right? And that everybody knows you're on that commercial side of that curve. And of course, that can get gray and it can get very difficult, but I think that's the key, is following those key principles.
Definitely echo those. There are a few key questions one can ask, right? is the operator proactively transparent, right? Does the operator, is there predictability in the operator's actions? Are they following the best practices and standards? If you have that predictability, something that is off nominal will look off, right? Best practices does also include cybersecurity standards. Does the operator have effective oversight and continuing supervision? The launching state will be liable for their actions if not. And are there economic incentives for operators to do better than just the bare minimum regulatory floor and just creating that economic incentive? Obviously through regulation, they should be doing the bare minimum, but there's above and beyond that one can do as well.
Thank you. Questions in the room, sir?
Hi, I hope you're not sick of me yet today, but I just wanted to bring up this morning's conversation when Richard discussed the nature of looking at the US government's response to private companies as a very multifaceted approach versus a potential portal approach, which is his lingo. I was wondering if the panelists had an opinion on what is the most effective way to communicate with the US government for all of its necessary functions.
I'll leave that to whoever would like to.
US government is very open to dialogue with the commercial industry. I'm very happy for that. We talked about there's formal ways to put your inputs into the government, rather through notice of proposed rulemakings, requests for comments, et cetera. There's just the relationship, places like here where you get to ask questions as well. And then there's federal advisory committees that industry players can be on and voice their inputs. And then in the international stage, this is what the State Department does very well, is collate what is the industry inputs into an important dialogue upcoming. So those are various modes where industry can be involved.
Thank you.
I'll take a little different tact on answering that question through sharing our experience on MEV and where we hope it transitions to in the future. So with our mission extension vehicles, it's a brand new mission area, right? Traditionally in the US, we have licensed geocomsats, we've licensed, Earth observation satellites, and that's really the only regimes we have. Now we come along with a vehicle that wants to go rendezvous and dock to another satellite and tug it around and do things to it. How do you license that? The government was very supportive, right? Starting with the State Department, working with the FCC and NOAA. I mean, we worked together to find a way to fit within the regulatory regime we have today. But that regime's not the right regime for us going forward with all of the diversity of new types of missions coming out. Now, the MEV is pretty lucky. It is going to GEO, it's docking to a geocomsat and staying there for a while. So, in a way, it's acting a lot like a comsat. So it made it pretty obvious the direction to go with that. But going forward, as a commercial entity, we want to make this as simple as possible, as low regulatory barriers as we can to make ourselves efficient and effective in doing our businesses. So having a single point of contact, whatever that is, to go in and do our licensing is, ideal for us. Simply adding another layer that says, well, now you do this one, but it still has to go to these other three, right? That's going to create bureaucracy and time and problems. So we don't want that to happen, right? We don't want to just add another layer on top of the other ones that exist. I think it is at least it's sort of my perception, my thoughts on that.
I would add that, we tend to say the US government, and we think of it sometimes as this ubiquitous mass, and it's this one thing. But in fact, it's all these different elements, Department of State, Department of Commerce, FCC, FAA, and so forth. And so there are some, I think, really rich relationships between commercial companies and these different elements that are fitting the bill. But further than that, I have seen within government, and Diane Poster here is here from NIST, efforts to work sort of this interagency thing, recognizing that there are all these fingers inside of the government, And for example, on my side, the commercial SSA side, there's some very capable SSA companies out there. And so she has worked to sort of integrate some of the standards dialogue. And, you know, I like to see that, and I hope to see that, you know, in other elements of the dialogue. But I think that goal of bringing the government together and bringing the commercial together is where it's at.
I'm hopefully not shocking anyone when I say that the US government is big and it is complicated. And one thing that comes up in the paper on the issue of interfacing between commercial actors and the government is because the US government is big and complicated, it can be sometimes challenging to know who to call, especially on specific niche issues in space. Whose responsibility is that? And how do you contact them is not always the most apparent. And that's of particular significance for new space actors, new companies, small companies, those that don't yet have the resources or the relationships to know exactly how to navigate that. And so from a norms perspective and looking forward, having the options just to know who to call is a very significant first step beyond even how does the interface work in the long term.
All right, thank you, Robin. Well, we are coming up on the end of our time here, and I have to offer my apologies to the 10 other questioners in the online chat that I was unable to get through. But it is, I think, been a really helpful conversation. And again, my thanks to particularly our industry colleagues here, as was said earlier. Showing up is a critical first step, and as Charity said, if we're going to be successful in this incredibly complex, increasingly democratized and high stakes environment, we got to do more than just show up now. We got to be prepared. We got to do our best, and we got to be prepared to win and, you know, really make a difference. So thanks to everybody in the audience for coming out. I wanted to thank the panel, and I wanted to ask my colleague Scott Pace to rejoin me, and we can wrap up for the event. Thank you all for joining.
Maybe we'll do something really radical, and we'll give people back, 10 minutes of their day. Early. And if there are excess cookies out there, please take them. So better. So first of all, I really want to thank both panels and especially our industry colleagues for participating in this. And I think that what's been laid out, particularly in the first panel, was there's a number of different ways we can go after this particular announcement. There is, I think, frankly, a concern that the Vice President's announcement could be kind of considered a one and done. We did the announcement, we're done. If we don't do anything else, okay, fine. That isn't particularly satisfactory. I think it has helped change the conversation, and we could go in a number of different directions, either in terms of formalizing that commitment among a larger number of nations. And I think really the most immediate next step is getting other people to try to sign up and be supportive of where we are in a more explicit and formal manner. Obviously, we would love it if that included the Russians and Chinese, but even Stevens, just our regular friends and allies, and I think that will be worthwhile. I think what the other panel here has shown in the prior discussion is that we do have, I think, a pretty coherent way forward diplomatically with these norms. That is, we get technical experts who actually do real things like MEV1. And with that actual demonstration of capability, we look for best practices on how they would like things to work. And then we demonstrate that, take precedence of it, be good cooperative people, calling folks and giving them notice beforehand and all that. And then we take those practices and we bring them into the multilateral community, into COPAS and OEWG and other things like that to shape understanding of it. And then out of that can come international consensus. So even if non-binding, represents a multilateral consensus that can in turn flow back to the nation states. So sovereign power always relies with the nation state, but that the multilateral international community have a critical role to play in exactly what it is we're going to be, regulating. So there's a partnership here. I used to say when I first went into government that at the Commerce Department, that I discovered that true change only happened when there is an open conspiracy between the political staff and the career staff. Both of them are necessary. Politicals can make openings happen that careers cannot. Careers can make things permanent and real and enduring in ways that politicals cannot. And I think in this case, we have bipartisan, multi-administration, political leadership, career leadership, but we need partnership with our commercial and international partners to make it real and enduring beyond just the ideas that we have here. Probably the most difficult step after convincing other people that this is a good direction to go in, whether it's rendezvous and proximity or destructive testing or remediation, a number of different directions, is going to be those discussions with Russia and China. Obviously, Russia is problematic. We last had a space security dialogue in 2020, was I think fairly productive and substantive, but of course, since that time, having those kind of discussions is pretty problematic right now. Unless somebody tells me we haven't had one with the Chinese lately on space security. Okay, still working that. Yet the Chinese have been, in multilateral forums, I think, remarkably pragmatic on a number of issues. Yes, there are problems and gaps, but they're going to be working in space. So if we're going to be on the moon, they're going to be on the moon. We need ways to communicate. We need ways to do rescue and return. We need to do ways to deconflict. So I still hold out some sliver of hope for practical cooperation with China, even if I don't see a larger rapprochement going on. I should point out in the area of standards that the Chinese do use Consultative Committee on Space Data Standards quite routinely. So when the Chang'e missions go to the moon, because they used open communication standards, the European Space Agency was able to provide cross support for them. Doesn't mean they could have done something else, but because they chose that, there were options, diplomatic options for cooperation that would not have existed without those kinds of standards. But China is trying to develop its own commercial space agency, or at least revenue producing. I don't know if they're really commercial, but they're certainly revenue producing. Dialogue with those entities is going to be crucial if we're going to come to any sort of consensus, and we simply don't have that as far as I can tell. So that's the immediate work to be done. Convince other people that we're going in the right direction. Get other people to join the party, and hang with our team. Open up more communications, and use all the different aspects of U.S. national power, that is government, cultural, social, if you will, NGOs, industry, and a multifaceted approach to engage with the world and secure our interests on this domain.
Thank you, Scott. And, this is the 5th anniversary of us starting this collaboration. The first time we put this event together, there was expanded media interest, because I believe the morning of the event, the Vice President announced that he was selecting Scott to be the Executive Secretary of the National Space Council. So it was appropriate that we commemorated this version of the event with the now current Executive Secretary of the National Space Council, and words from the Dean of the school here that she could think of no one better than the new incumbent, which I presume was because she wanted you back from her sabbatical, from your sabbatical.
University was generous with me. I pushed that.
It's a valuable partnership, and Aerospace and our Center for Space Policy and Strategy really appreciate it. This is a classic competimates situation. We are constantly hitting refresh on Google to see, if you search for space policy, who is higher in the hit list. Is it SPI or the Center for Space Policy and Strategy? If you refresh now, we have more hits on the first page, but they are higher. So it's a great partnership. And I think the community, both online and in the room today, and the questions that people are asking of the panelists speak to the value of this collaboration. The excitement and energy in space today is real. It's real for a reason. And the problems and opportunities facing the nation and the world are of a scale that requires a lot of exchange of ideas. The answers are not immediately obvious, straightforward, or easy to achieve. They're going to require hard work, as Charity challenged us. So this is part of that, and hopefully we move the ball, if only a small amount today, and we look forward to continuing to move the ball together. Thank you to everybody that made this happen, and appreciate the attention from everyone in the audience.
And wishing everyone a great afternoon, and we turn the beautiful day back to you.